LoveLore Library. Chapter 1175. It had to be said that Shui Lan's disguise technique was extremely brilliant. Ning Xuema was disguised as an ordinary young girl by him, while he himself was disguised as a simple young man. He held her hand and looked like a young man and woman from the countryside who had eloped. When these two people walked on the streets of the Immortal Kingdom, they didn't stand out at all. Ning Xuema's mute acupoint had been sealed, and her psychokinesis was sealed again. She could only walk like a normal person. She ran to crowded places, and the bustling crowd gave her a sense of familiarity. It was only at this moment that she realized what the saying, "humans are social animals," meant. Now that she had returned to the crowd, even if she couldn't communicate, she still had the urge to cry. Shui Lan had been following her closely, and he didn't lose sight of her at all. Ning Xuema naturally didn't have the chance to communicate with anyone alone. When it was time for lunch, Shui Lan chose the largest restaurant in the area. The two of them were dressed like country bumpkins, and their appearance also carried a kind of rustic aura. However, when they arrived at the most expensive restaurant, they were almost stopped by the waiter at the entrance. Shui Lan threw out a handful of crystal beads, which immediately lit up the waiter's eyes. He bowed and welcomed the two of them in. Shui Lan originally wanted a single room, but Ning Xuema insisted on eating in the hall on the second floor. Ning Xuema couldn't communicate with people normally right now, so it was good to be able to listen to them talk. Restaurants had always been a place for gossip. She might be able to hear some news about Shinjiuli here. She had missed him so much in the past year that she almost went crazy. When she came, she was still holding on to the possibility that she might bump into Shinjiuli here. What if he came here to look for her? After all, she and Shinjiuli had come to this restaurant before. The great god had even peeled crabs for her here, and she had even smeared crab roe on her hand. It was also here that she had given him the moonlight sword. He had even teased her, saying that she had given him her dowry so early. However, she was disappointed in the end. There were many people in the hall, but there was no sign of him. She couldn't even find a figure that resembled him. She had heard a lot of gossip here, but none of it was about him. It was all about the business and family, and there was nothing to remember. Shui Lan probably wanted to win her favor, so he ordered a table full of her favorite dishes and accompanied her to drink a few bottles of wine. Ning Xuema had been locked up by him for more than a year, so she rarely smiled. Now, she finally smiled a little more. However, she would occasionally stare at the neighboring table in a daze, as if she was deep in thought. He also glanced at the neighboring table. There was a couple there. The man was handsome, and the woman was beautiful. They looked like a perfect couple. The two of them looked very loving, but there was nothing special about them. He turned to look at Ning Xuema's plate. He had also picked up a lot of food for her. Although she didn't refuse, she didn't taste a single thing. She obviously didn't accept his kindness. His fingers holding the chopsticks were somewhat pale, and there seemed to be a trace of pain in the depths of his eyes. She had clearly recovered her memories of Shui Emo, so why was she still so cold to him? Why was she still thinking about that man? He glanced at the neighboring table again, and suddenly felt that the couple's display of affection was somewhat dazzling. Shui Lan didn't say anything. He only flicked his fingernails at the table between meals. The movement was so small that it was almost unnoticeable. Chapter 1176. Ning Xuema's attention wasn't on him at all, so she naturally didn't see his small movements. Her ability to recognize people was very high. She would remember them for the rest of her life if they interacted with her once. She recognized the two people at the next table. More accurately, she had seen them before. When she and the great god first came here, this couple had bought a few crystal beads in a fit of pique. That man had chased after the girl and apologized for a long time. She couldn't help but laugh when she saw it, even teasing the great god beside her. It was clearly a very normal scene, but now that she thought about it, it was a happiness that she could never touch again. Great God, where are you? It's been so long, why haven't you looked for me? And I can't find you. It had been a year and a half. She and the great god had been separated for a year and a half. She hadn't heard from him for a year and a half. Was he missing her like she was? It was like a lump of iron was stuck in her heart. She felt that the food she normally liked to eat was tasteless. Her mood instantly plummeted. She finished the meal emotionlessly and stood up. Shuailan was a good understanding person, immediately asking, "Do you want to go somewhere else?" Ning Xuema couldn't speak, so she could only give a slight nod. The two of them were about to go down the stairs together when they heard two putong sounds behind them. Then they heard someone cry out in alarm. Ning Xuema unconsciously turned around and her feet froze. The couple that had been eating at the next table had fallen to the ground. Their faces were green and they were constantly twitching. They had been poisoned. The customs of the immortal nation were very simple and friendly. The guests at the other tables immediately surrounded them. Some of them even squatted down to check on the couple. A teacup suddenly flew over. It smashed into the wrist of the man who wanted to flip the couple over. That man was caught off guard and the back of his hand was bruised. He angrily raised his head. "Who hit me?" An ordinary-looking girl quickly walked over and pushed him aside. Then she wrote a few words on the ground. "Poison, you will die if you touch it." The man was so shocked that he broke out in a cold sweat. The people around who were about to help the couple didn't dare to move. They all looked at Ning Xuema for help. "Miss, you know medicine, right? Please save them." Ning Xuema stared coldly at Shuailan. Needless to say, he was the one behind this. Shuailan smiled and transmitted his voice to her. "Momo, do you want to save them?" Ning Xuema just stared at him. Shuailan continued, "If you want me to save them, I can do it. Give me a kiss, and I will do it." Ning Xuema, she did not look at him again. Instead, she turned around and squatted in front of the two men. She pulled out a silver hairpin from her hair and used the tip of the hairpin to hit the two men's acupuncture points. Then, he quickly wrote down the names of a few herbs on the ground and asked the people around him to pick them up quickly. The onlookers were quite enthusiastic. Someone immediately ran over and came back with the herbs in a short amount of time. Although Ning Xuema's psychokinesis was sealed, she was very experienced in treating patients. She was especially good at curing poisons. Even if she didn't use the special antidote, she could still use her own methods to solve the problem. Shuailan narrowed his eyes as he watched her busying herself. He didn't know what he was feeling. He could actually stop her from saving them with a wave of his hand, but he couldn't bear to do it when he saw her current appearance. These days, Ning Xuema was like an expressionless doll in front of him. Her eyes were always in a daze. It was rare to see her so serious. Chapter 1177. In less than an hour, Ning Xuema had successfully cured the couple of poison. Naturally, they were extremely grateful. The surrounding people looked at Ning Xuema with eyes full of admiration. No matter where, a godly doctor was extremely popular. Ning Xuema had saved two people with just a few needles. Naturally, she had become a legend. When she left the restaurant and wandered around the streets, there were already people calling her a godly doctor. There were even people who invited her to treat their relatives. There were many famous and influential people among them. Ning Xuema had probably been holding it in for too long. Now that there was an opportunity to be in close contact with people, she naturally wouldn't let it go. She didn't reject anyone who came. Shuailan was naturally unwilling. He was a devil. In his heart, Ning Xuema was also a devil. It had always been the devil who harmed people. He had never heard of a devil who frequently saved people. He wanted to stop her, but when he saw Ning Xuema's excited expression, he couldn't bear to do so. In the end, he decided to forget it. It was rare for him to accompany her for a day. He would just let her be happy. Thus, even though he was unwilling, he still became Ning Xuema's follower. One day flew by while Ning Xuema was in the process of treating and saving people. When the sky turned dark, Ning Xuema had already treated 5 to 6 patients. Almost all of them were cured. Thus, her reputation spread even more. There were more people who came to seek treatment because of her reputation. Naturally, there were people who respectfully asked for Ning Xuema's name. Ning Xuema couldn't answer, and Shui Lan didn't bother to answer. Thus, those people didn't get anything out of Ning Xuema. They felt that Ning Xuema was even more mysterious. Thus, they gave her the title of Nameless Godly Doctor. Ning Xuema didn't expect that she would make a name for herself. When she saved the couple, it was only because the couple reminded her of the Almighty. She couldn't bear to see the couple disappear just like that. Thus, she didn't think too much before she saved them. But later on, she consciously established her own reputation. The Almighty knew that her medical skills were outstanding. If he was really looking for her, he might come looking for her after hearing her name. With this thought in mind, she became even more enthusiastic and serious when she saw the doctor. When it was dark, Shui Lan wanted to drag her away, but when he saw how energetic she was when she was treating patients, he held himself back. It had been a long time since he had seen her like this. When she was treating patients, even the way she looked at him had become much gentler and warmer. It was no longer as frighteningly cold. That night, when they had dinner together, she ate some of the dishes that he had picked for her for the first time. She even smiled. For this reason, Shui Lan decided to stay here for another day. At night, the two of them entered an inn. Shui Lan was naturally worried about leaving her alone in a room, so he directly asked for a guest room. Ning Xuema knew that she couldn't resist, so she didn't react. Anyway, there were 2 beds in the guest room. She and Shui Lan could take one each. After all, she had dealt with Shui Lan for more than a year. She knew that he wouldn't force himself on her again. Shui Lan was indeed very well behaved. He automatically laid down on a bed and didn't have any intention of disturbing Ning Xuema. He also unsealed Ning Xuema's mute acupoint so that she could speak to him. However, the other acupoints on her body were still sealed. Ning Xuema couldn't shout for help. Ning Xuema didn't plan to shout for help either. She knew that although the people in Bulow City didn't age or die, their martial arts were very shallow. They were no match for Shui Lan. Chapter 1178. Even if she shouted for help and called for help, it would only add a few innocent lives. Moreover, if she angered him, he might directly take her back and never give her a chance to come out again. Therefore, after Ning Xuema's mute acupoint was unsealed, she was still very calm, which made Shui Lan feel a lot more relieved. Today, he stayed by Ning Xuema's side, afraid that she would play tricks, so he almost didn't blink his eyes. After such a long day, he was also a bit tired and fell asleep not long after lying on the bed. He was also afraid that after he fell asleep, Ning Xuema would look for an opportunity to escape. Thus, he used a technique to place a curse on her wrist. Ning Xuema's movements in this room were nothing, but once she left, he would immediately be able to detect her and catch her back. The room quieted down. Ning Xuema sat on her own bed, her gaze falling on Shui Lan, her gaze somewhat complicated. These days, she naturally saw Shui Lan's attitude and accommodating attitude towards her. If she said that she didn't have any feelings in her heart, that would be a lie. After all, there were still memories of her previous life. Looking at those memories, Shuailan was the only one who depended on Shuailan. When Shuailan was seriously injured and on the verge of death, she went to the immortal world to become a spy in order to save him. In the end, she killed the great god and took his heart's blood, pulling Shuailan back from the brink of death. After Shuailan was revived, Shuailan cherished him even more, and even had the thought of marrying him. Under the devil ancestors' auspices, they almost went through the wedding ceremony. On that day, if Shinjioli hadn't used the snowy talisman as a spy and brought the immortal world's people to kill their way in, catching the demon world unprepared and causing a disaster, perhaps she really would have married Shuailan and become his wife. In those memories, at the very end, Shinjioli had heavily injured her and coldly watched as she was killed by the snow-robe talisman. From start to finish, he didn't even frown. As for Shuailan, in order to save Shuai-Emo, he was once again severely injured by Shinjioli and ended up being sealed. Ningxiuema actually felt that she was quite strange. According to her memories from her previous life, she seemed to have a special liking for Shuailan. Even if she didn't recover her memories, she should have a good impression of him, and even hazy feelings of love. But for some reason, she didn't like him now. She even felt a little disgusted. Even though she had regained her memory, she still didn't have that kind of feeling for him. No matter how well he treated her, she couldn't find the feeling of love for him. She only felt a little guilty when she saw him down. Occasionally, he would feel some pain in his heart. It was the pain of seeing his little brother being bullied. But guilt wasn't love. What's more, although he saved her, he also imprisoned her at the same time. He raised her like a canary and didn't give her the slightest freedom. Every time she thought of this, even that little bit of guilt would vanish. She closed her eyes and prepared to adjust her breathing. Suddenly, the shop assistant knocked on the door, saying that someone was looking for treatment. The person who was looking for treatment was very special. It was Blacksmith Yi. Ningxiuema's heart was moved. This Blacksmith Yi was the one who made her moonlight sword. He could be considered an acquaintance. Perhaps she could ask him to pass on a message. She was about to go out when Shuailan sat up and looked at her with a smile that wasn't a smile. You want to treat him? Ningxiuema nodded. Saving people is like putting out a fire. I don't know when you became so compassionate. Momo, are you really a demon? Ningxiuema sneered. I only do things according to my heart. Whether it's an immortal or a demon, it doesn't matter to me. Chapter 1179. Shuailan looked at her for a long time. His eyes flickered slightly. It was unknown what he was looking at her for. Ningxiuema simply sat there and let him look at her. Finally, she tilted her head and smiled at him. It was unknown whether it was a real smile or a taunting one. Shuailan, I remember you said that you will always treat me as your master. Is this how you treat me? Shuailan choked. His eyes drooped slightly and he sighed, Momo, as long as you really come back, I will always treat you as my master. But, you seem to. Ningxiuema didn't say anything and only looked at him indifferently. That kind of gaze was similar to how Shuai-Emo looked at him 3,000 years ago when he was incompetent. Shuailan's heart was stifled and he felt pain again. Every time she showed this kind of expression, he didn't want to disobey her no matter what. It was the same now. He finally agreed to let Ningxiuema treat Blacksmith Ye's illness. Blacksmith Yi was carried in. More than half of his left arm was broken. His whole body was dripping with blood and he was in so much pain that he almost fainted. It was said that when he was forging the sword at night, he accidentally fell on the sword he had just forged. This was a surgical operation. Ningxiuema was very good at it, but the equipment wasn't suitable. Fortunately, she had Shuailan by her side. This guy knew metal attribute magic. According to Ningxiuema's needs, he could easily condense the scalpel and other things she wanted, Blacksmith Yi was in a semi-conscious state, but he could clearly see Ning Xuema's every move. He always felt that Ning Xuema was somewhat familiar, but he couldn't remember where he had seen her before. Ning Xuema's treatment method was very special. Not to mention the people in this country, even Shui Lan had never seen it before. During the treatment process, she ordered Shui Lan to do this and that from time to time. Her words were crisp and clear, making it impossible for people to refuse. Shui Lan was amused, but he was willing to be her assistant. Of course, that was only if she did not order him out of the room. His gaze fell on Ning Xuema from time to time. He vaguely felt that his Momo had changed after he was reincarnated. They would become stronger, more self-centered, and more carefree. Perhaps it was due to the environment, but in the previous life, Shui Emo was somewhat gloomy. Her temperament was also unstable, and she had a kind of numbness that went with the flow. But in this life, she was much more lively and cheerful. In her previous life, she would either smile when she was socializing, sneering, or smiling out of boredom. She had never seen her smile from the bottom of her heart. However, in this life, he had seen her laugh a few times. She laughed heartily, laughed freely, and even laughed without a care in the world. However, her sincere smiles were not brought to her by him, and the character she was smiling at was not him. In her dreams, when she was with Shinjuli, there were many times when she smiled sincerely, which he had never seen when she was by his side. Some things couldn't be thought about. Once you thought about it, you would find it hard to calm down, and you would be upset and irritable. Shui Lan secretly took a breath and suppressed the tumbling emotions in his chest. On the surface, he was calm and collected, but secretly, he had been paying attention to her. Even if she wanted to play tricks, she would not be able to find a chance to do so. The operation was finally completed smoothly. Casting Master Ye's almost broken arm was finally successfully reconnected by Ning Xuema. According to Ning Xuema, as long as he recuperated for half a year, his arm would be as good as before. Casting Master Yi was very excited. In the end, he left with gratitude. Chapter 1180. When Blacksmith Yi went in, he was carried in, but when he came out, he walked out on his own. In the eyes of the people waiting below, this was a miracle. Even after Blacksmith Yi left, Shui Lan still didn't find out what Ning Xuema was up to. He didn't want to stay in the store any longer, so he brought Ning Xuema back that very night. In the Immortal Kingdom, Ning Xuema's fame as a nameless divine doctor became even more resounding and bright. After a few days, almost the entire kingdom knew about her. She became the topic of conversation in the streets, restaurants, and tea houses. Shui Lan found that after Ning Xuema went out, she became much more lively. She was no longer as lifeless as before. To prevent the same thing from happening again, after he brought her back to the barrier, he unsealed her acupoints to recover her mental power. Since his skills were much higher than hers, even if she recovered, she wouldn't be his opponent. More importantly, without him leading the way, she wouldn't be able to leave. He also knew that Ning Xuema was an expert in breaking barriers, so the barriers he set up were of the highest level. After Shui Lan recovered his memories from his past life, his skills also recovered. Now, his skills weren't much worse than Shinjuli's. His ability to set up barriers was especially outstanding. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to break the barrier on Heavenly Sound Peak in time and save Ning Xuema from Wu Mo's hands. Of course, to be safe, he set up layers of barriers. Even if Ning Xuema broke one of them, there was still a second barrier to stop her. No matter which barrier was broken, he could quickly sense it and quickly rush over. He also threatened Ning Xuema. If he found out that she was breaking barriers, he would cancel her benefits of going out twice a year. Ning Xuema never fought an unprepared battle. Before she had full confidence, she wouldn't act blindly. After returning, she began to cultivate diligently. Now, she was already at the 7.5 level of the Earth rank. As long as she reached the 8th level, she would be able to find a way to truly break through his 2 layers of enchantments and directly escape. Before that, as long as Shuailan didn't cross her bottom line, she wouldn't cross his bottom line either. Shuailan's barrier was quite abundant in spiritual energy, so it didn't delay Ning Xuemo's cultivation. It was only at this moment that Ning Xuemo realized how difficult it was to advance from level 7 to level 8. Back then, Yilu Jing had once told her that even if he had risen from the 7th level to the 8th level, it had still taken him a full 50 years, and he had even been hailed as the fastest leveler in the Tian-Ci continent. It was unknown how many people were stuck at this level, unable to break through until the day they died. This was like an insurmountable natural moat. Once he crossed it, it would be a smooth journey. Ning Xuemo was cultivating here. Firstly, there wasn't a good teacher to guide her. Secondly, the little loli in her body had recently shown signs of awakening. As long as her mind was slightly shaken, the little loli's voice would ring in her ears like a demon's voice, causing her to be impetuous, and the speed of her cultivation naturally slowed down by a lot. Time flew by like a shuttle, and time was like lightning. Unknowingly, 10 years had passed. In these 10 years, Shuailan could be considered to have kept his promise. Every year, he would bring her out twice, to different continents, different places. There were some places that Ning Xuemo had followed the great god to, and some places that she had never been to before. The local conditions and customs were completely different. The only place that they didn't go was the place that she wanted to go the most in the Tian-Ci continent. These times, most of them were just for a day's stroll. The chance encounter that Ning Xuemo was looking forward to didn't happen. Chapter 1181. Ning Xuemo did not hear any news about Shinjiuli in the restaurants and tea houses. 10 years of life and death, it was unforgettable if one did not think about it. Ning Xuemo never thought that she would be separated from the great god for such a long time. She did not even know if the great god was alive or dead. She did not know if he was alive or dead, and he probably did not know if she was alive or dead either. The little loli in her body had been jumping around in her mind recently, saying that she, the heavenly lone star, had cursed the people closest to her to death. She wanted to pull it out from her body and smash it into pieces. Ning Xuemo was not someone to be trifled with. When the little loli in her body was talking nonsense with her, Ning Xuemo sneered, "If the heavenly lone star is cursed to the people closest to her, then why don't you die? Shouldn't you be the one who should be cursed to death?" This sentence finally made the little loli in her body shut up for a few days, and Ning Xuemo finally had a period of peace. When it was close to the 10th year, Ning Xuemo's psychokinesis finally reached the critical point of Earth rank level 7 to level 8. She did not know why, but when she reached this point, she seemed to be unable to find a way to increase her psychokinesis, and stopped at the critical point. Her heart was anxious, and she often felt like her period was coming. She could not help but get angry, cry, and throw tantrums for no reason. Sometimes, she even wanted to make a scene out of hysteria, and even wanted to commit suicide. Even Shuailan didn't dare to provoke her rashly. He didn't want her to break down and do something to harm herself. He originally brought Ning Xuemo out every June. This time, he probably wanted to help her get rid of her depression, so he actually brought her out in March. The place they went to was the place Ning Xuemo yearned for day and night, Tian-Ci continent. When she saw the familiar buildings, the familiar city walls, and the familiar streets, Ning Xuemo felt her legs trembling. 10 years. She had left this place for 10 years. She never thought that she would miss a place so much. It was even more intense than a wanderer missing home. Shuailan brought her to the vast Sky Empire's capital. 10 years ago, she had transmigrated here and started her adventure. She had met many people and experienced a lot of things. It was also here that she had her first encounter with Shinjioli and the enmity that followed. She had been locked up by Shuilan for 10 whole years. Many things could happen in 10 years. For example, when Ning Xuema came here this time, Luhin Ti died and a new emperor ascended the throne. Tea houses, restaurants, tea houses, and post stations were all gossipy places. Everywhere, people were talking about this. Ning Xuema only drank a few cups of tea in the tea house, and such gossip filled her ears. It was said that the crown prince, Ji Yunhuang, who was the pride of the entire vast Sky Empire, seemed to have gone crazy after the death of his wife. He ran all over the continent, looking for a way to revive the dead. His whereabouts were unknown, and he often lost contact with them. He did not care about the affairs of vast Sky Empire anymore. This made Luhin Ti very angry. He sent countless people to find this crown prince and told him that if he continued to be crazy, he would remove his position as crown prince. However, Ji Yunhuang did not care and did not have any intention of coming back. This made Luhin Ti so angry that he almost had a stroke. Fortunately, the sixth prince, Ji Yunhao, often treated him well and helped him share many of the country's affairs. This also made Luhin Ti pay attention to his son again. According to the news from the palace, Luhin Ti had the intention to change the crown prince. Adding a chapter for the monthly ticket. Chapter 1182. However, before the imperial edict to appoint a new crown prince could be passed down, Luhin Ti suddenly fell ill and died. Ji Yunhao was originally a man of great talent and bold vision. In the past 10 years, he had nurtured many henchmen and more than half of the court officials were under his influence. With Luhin Ti's death and Ji Yunhuang's disappearance, the successor to the throne naturally fell on Ji Yunhao. The day that Ning Xuema arrived was the day of Ji Yunhao's coronation. All the citizens of the city went to watch Ji Yunhao's coronation. It was said that the coronation was very grand and solemn. However, Ning Xuema did not have any interest in watching it. When the people in the tea house discussed this grand occasion, their saliva naturally flew everywhere. Of course, when they mentioned Ji Yunhuang, they could not help but shake their heads. He was obviously a heaven-gifted genius, but who would have thought that he would be destroyed in the hands of a cauldron? It seems that when Lord Heavenly Teacher bestowed Tian Shueching to the original crown prince, it was a disaster. Someone sighed. That's right. If it was not for that Tian Shueching, the original crown prince would not have gone crazy. The one ascending the throne right now might be Her Highness Yunhuang. Someone added. Shoo, don't talk about national affairs. You don't want to live anymore. Someone stopped him in a low voice. His tone was filled with panic and fear. Ning Xuema sat there and listened without saying a word. She did not know what she was feeling in her heart. Ji Yunhuang was her friend. She thought that Tian Shueching's death would at most be a heavy blow to him and that he would at most be depressed for 1 or 2 years before recovering. However, she did not expect that the ending would be like this. This ending was probably something that Tian Shueching did not expect, right? On the other hand, Ji Yunhao had benefited from it and obtained the throne for nothing. Seeing your friend fall to this state, you must feel bad, right? If you hadn't met Ji Yunhuang back then, he wouldn't have fallen in love with you. If he didn't fall in love with you, Shinjioli wouldn't have forced Tian Shueching onto him. He also wouldn't have found Shui Mo, who was similar to you, to fall in love with him and make Tian Shueching feel even more hopeless. I heard that Tian Shueching died to save Shui Mo. TSK, after all these chain of events, the main culprit is still you, Ning Xuema. Your fate as a jinx has trapped everyone close to you. You can only get rid of this fate if you turn into a demon. The little loli in her mind began to chatter again. Ning Xuema fiercely gulped down a mouthful of tea. She wished she could drown the little loli in her stomach. This damned heart demon was simply trying to push all kinds of shit onto her head, constantly trying to seduce her into becoming a demon, but she just had to listen. In order to divert her attention, she went to listen to those people's gossip. By the way, I wonder if Lord Dizun will come this time. Someone suddenly asked. Ning Xuema's heart suddenly jumped. In 10 years, this was the first time she heard news about him. She couldn't help but perk up her ears, afraid that she would miss a word. He should come, right? Lord Dizun usually comes to Chongkong country once every 18 years. Moreover, when the new emperors of the 5 countries ascend the throne, Lord Dizun will appear once. Lord Dizun sees Chongkong country in a new light. This time, he will definitely come for such a big event. By the way, 8 years ago, when the new emperor of Xianming country ascended the throne, Lord Dizun went. This time, he will definitely come. Really? Then we are in for a treat. I only heard that Lord Dizun came once 10 years ago. Unfortunately, I didn't get to meet him at that time. This time, I hope to see him once, even if I have to kneel until my knees break. The people at the neighboring table were discussing spiritedly. Chapter 1183. Ning Xuema's heart couldn't stop shaking as she listened. 8 years ago, the ancestor went to Xianming country. Was it Shinjioli or the fake Wu Mo? Who would appear this time? If something really happened to Shinjioli, wouldn't the entire Tianci continent be in turmoil? But now, he seemed to be very peaceful. He should be fine. If he was safe, why didn't he look for her? Was he seriously injured? He was secretly recuperating in a place. On the surface, he let Wu Mo take his place to guard the Tianci continent, but if he was only seriously injured, even if he couldn't move, he would send the Sun Moon sect's disciples to look for her. But she didn't seem to hear any news about this. Could it be that he hasn't come back yet? Thousands of questions hovered in Ning Xuema's mind, but she couldn't find an answer. Shui Lan sat next to her and watched her fingers unconsciously clench the teacup so tightly that even her fingernails turned white. He put his hand on Ning Xuema's shoulder and asked, "Momo, are you nervous?" Ning Xuema ignored him and just brushed his hand away. Shui Lan suddenly leaned close to her ear and said, "Momo, the ancestor will pass by here later. Maybe he will come to this tea house and sit down. Do you want to meet him directly?" Ning Xuema still didn't speak. For the past 10 years, she had been trapped in the barrier. Although she came out a few times, Shui Lan sealed her mute acupoint every time. She couldn't talk to anyone. Inside the barrier, she had changed 3 batches of maidservants, and each batch was made mute by Shui Lan. They couldn't talk to her. The only person she could talk to was Shui Lan, but she didn't want to talk to him. So, for the past 10 years, Ning Xuema rarely spoke. In total, she didn't speak 30 to 40 sentences. She almost couldn't communicate with people anymore. At this moment, both of them were still in disguise. This time, Shui Lan was a little immoral. He disguised her as a sickly girl with a face full of pockmarks and yellow hair, while he himself was still a graceful young man. Shui Lan relied on his high telekinesis and was too lazy to disguise himself. He only used a kind of camouflage to hide his true appearance. However, the people outside still saw him as a handsome man who was hard to find in heaven and earth. After sitting here for an hour, who knew how many young girls were secretly throwing flirtatious glances at him? Some even deliberately came over to strike up a conversation. However, Shui Lan didn't pay any attention to those girls. All of his energy was focused on Ning Xuema. From time to time, he would serve her tea and snacks. He sat beside her in an extremely intimate manner, as if she was a treasure that he was holding in the palm of his hand and protecting. That affectionate look made countless passers-by envious. This also made those young girls jealous. They didn't understand why such a handsome young man in front of them would fall in love with such an ugly girl. However, that ugly girl kept a cold face and didn't seem to care about her lover. This made those young girls who were secretly watching even more indignant. In their eyes, Shuilan was a fresh flower and Ning Xuemo was a pile of cow dung. Now, this fresh flower stuck in cow dung was enough to make people feel aggrieved. However, this cow dung still pretentiously avoided the fresh flower, probably because someone didn't like it. Another bold and beautiful young girl came over to strike up a conversation with Shuilan. She sat beside Shuilan and coquettishly asked Shuilan if he could buy her a drink. Chapter 1184. Shuilan looked at Ning Xuemo beside him. His heart skipped a beat, and he smiled gently at the young girl. His smile was as light as a flower blooming, sure. He poured her a cup of tea. The young girl was flattered. She took a sip of tea in a very ladylike manner, and then tried to strike up a conversation with Shuilan. Shuilan casually dealt with her while secretly observing Ning Xuemo's complexion. He wanted to see if there was anything strange about her face. However, he didn't expect that Ning Xuemo didn't notice him at all. Their table was next to the window, and her eyes were looking out of the window. Her gaze was empty. He didn't know what she was thinking. Shuilan suddenly felt his interest waning. He secretly clenched his fists. The current Ning Xuemo was exactly like the Xuemo of his previous life. Gloomy, calm, as if she didn't care about anything. She hid all her thoughts in her heart, making it impossible for people to guess what she was thinking. Ancestor. Ancestor has come. Ancestor has really appeared. Suddenly, an excited cry came from downstairs. In an instant, the whole tea house boiled over. Ning Xuemo, who had been lost in thought, suddenly straightened her body. The teacup in her hand shook, spilling tea all over her hand. Shuilan's eyes darkened. He raised his hand and took out a handkerchief from who knows where to wipe the tea stains on her hand. How could you be so careless? Although he was reprimanding her, his movements were gentle, as if the slightest bit of force would bruise her delicate skin. The tea was quite hot. It scalded her fingertips, but she didn't seem to feel it. She acted as if she hadn't heard Shuilan's reprimand. Her gaze continued to look down. No matter where Ancestor appeared, he wouldn't give advance notice. He would always appear suddenly. Of course, no matter where he appeared, he would cause a great sensation. This time was the same. Just like what Ning Xuemo had seen 10 years ago, the group of people escorting Ancestor's sedan seemed to emerge from the ground and slowly walk through the spacious street below. Wherever he went, people would fall to their knees. Everything seemed to be a repeat of the events from 10 years ago. Even the children and maids were wearing the same clothes, and the extravagance was the same. Ning Xuemo watched as the extremely noble carriage slowly moved forward under the escort of the crowd. She suddenly felt like she was reliving the old days. Her fingers slowly tightened around the teacup. She looked at the carriage and slightly lowered her eyes. It's not him. It wasn't him in the carriage. The one sitting inside should be the fake overlord, Wuemo. Although the curtains of the carriage were heavy, Ning Xuemo relied on her keen sixth sense to come to this conclusion. Her gaze once again fell upon the carriage, and a cold glint flashed in her eyes. 10 years ago, this Wumo plotted against her and almost caused her to lose her life. Because of this, she fell into the hands of Shuilan and was imprisoned for 10 years. He caused her to be so miserable, but he still leisurely acted as his fake overlord. It seemed that he didn't receive any punishment. It seemed that the matter of him plotting against her was covered up by him. That's why he could still live so comfortably. However, she was trapped in hell. Sooner or later, she would get back at him for this. Probably because her gaze was too intense, Wu Mo, who was in the passing carriage, felt his heart tremble slightly. He raised his head and looked towards Ning Xuemo's direction. Ning Xuemo was sitting on the second floor of the tea house. The window was half open. Ning Xuemo only revealed a small part of her body. From Wu Mo's direction, he could only see her pockmarked face. Chapter 1185. Although Ning Xuemo's martial arts were sealed, her senses were still sharp. She immediately sensed Wu Mo's probing gaze and changed her expression. She looked down curiously. One had to admit that Shui Lan's disguise technique was very good. Wu Mo looked at Ning Xuemo a few times but still couldn't see through her disguise. Seeing that she was an ugly woman with an ordinary face, Wu Mo didn't take it to heart and continued to meditate with his eyes closed. Di Zun's carriage finally disappeared at the other end of the long street. The tea house returned to its previous lively state. Everyone was talking about the purpose of Di Zun's visit. Naturally, they were in high spirits. Ning Xuemo was also somewhat dispirited, but she still listened to the people's discussion. She wanted to gather some information about Di Zun from their nonsense. However, she was soon disappointed. Di Zun had always been very mysterious. He came and went like a ghost. Moreover, he had a substitute. Most people didn't know his true face. They didn't even know who was the real Di Zun, let alone other things. According to them, Di Zun had appeared 3 times in the past 10 years. Each time, he came and went like this. Most people didn't even see a corner of his clothes. Ning Xuemo listened for a long time but still couldn't gather the information she wanted. She couldn't help but feel disappointed. It seemed that it would be difficult to get accurate information about Shinjiuli as long as she didn't escape from Shui Lan's control. This time, she could only rely on herself. Ning Xuemo had been trapped in the enchantment for the first year. Every day, she hoped that Shinjiuli would come down from the sky and save her. She hoped that he would tell her that he was fine, then, she waited year after year. The more she waited, the more disappointed she became. The more she waited, the more anxious and desperate she became. But now, she was suddenly frightened. She had always been independent. When did she become like a daughter flower and depend on others? She had to rely on herself. The most important thing now was to break through to level 8. Only by breaking through to level 8 could she escape from Shui Lan's imprisonment. However, her psychokinesis suddenly stopped advancing. It was stuck there. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't break through. She became a little impatient again and slammed her teacup on the table, startling the beautiful girl who was chatting with Shui Lan. That young girl took advantage of the pleasant conversation she had with Shui Lan and felt that this handsome man in front of her was quite fond of her, so she didn't put this ugly girl, Ning Xuemo, in her eyes. Seeing Ning Xuemo holding the teacup, she thought that Ning Xuemo was jealous. She couldn't help but curl her lips. Oh, is this big sister angry? Ning Xuemo glanced at her. She had no idea what she was talking about, so she didn't bother to pay attention to it. Seeing that Ning Xuemo didn't say anything, the young girl felt that she was easy to bully. She continued, "Big sister, you have such a good husband. It's a blessing from your previous life. But the young master is such an excellent person. It's impossible for him to marry only one. Moreover, big sister's appearance is so ordinary. You shouldn't be jealous." The young girl spoke with assurance, as if she was a woman who adhered to the 3 obediences and 4 virtues. Ning Xuemo looked at her as if she was crazy. She then looked at Shui Lan. Shui Lan crossed his arms and looked at them with a faint smile. It was obvious that he was watching the show. Ning Xuemo couldn't speak. She was too lazy to argue with this infatuated young girl. She looked away and looked out of the window again, thinking about her next move. Chapter 1186. The girl was completely ignored by Ning Xuemo. She couldn't help but get angry. Her pretty face tensed up. What? Is this sister disdaining to talk to me? Ning Xuemo still ignored her. The girl was finally angry. She slammed her palm on the table. You ugly girl, why are you so arrogant? Her action was not small. Almost everyone in the tea house was alarmed. Countless pairs of eyes looked at Ning Xuemo's table. Ning Xuemo finally turned around. Her gaze fell on the girl's face. Then, she picked up the cup of tea on the table and raised it to the girl. The girl thought that Ning Xuemo was finally frightened by her and apologized to her with tea instead of wine. She was even more proud. She snorted coldly, you are so rude. You want to toast me with a cup of tea? Forget it. Before she could finish her sentence, a cup of hot tea was poured directly on her head. The girl screamed and jumped up with tea juice on her head. You, bitch. She seemed to want to scold Ning Xuemo. However, in front of Shuailan, she suddenly remembered that she had to take care of her image. She immediately turned to Shuailan and cried, Master, look at her. She's too bitchy. Shuailan looked at her, you mean she's too bitchy? Yes, she's just like a bitch. The girl's voice was full of grievances. Shuailan slowly picked up the teapot on the table and slowly poured the whole pot of tea on the girl's head. I think she should be more bitchy. The tea seemed to have just been boiled. The girl was crying like a ghost and howling like a wolf after being scalded. However, her body seemed to be fixed. She couldn't escape at all. Shuailan finished pouring the whole pot of tea on her head. Then, he waved his sleeve like he was swatting a fly. Get lost. Thus, before the young girl, who was scalded to death, could react, she had already flown out of the window and landed on the street. Shuailan's display of strength shocked everyone present. The other girls who were envious of the bold girl who was able to chat with the handsome man immediately kept quiet out of fear. They no longer dared to have any thoughts of striking up a conversation. Shuailan sat down again. His gaze fell on Ning Xuemo's face, and he smiled like a spring breeze. Wife, I've wronged you just now. Come, have some desserts to cool down. Him calling her a wife successfully gave Ning Xuemo goosebumps all over her body. She didn't know what was wrong with Shuailan this time, but he kept calling her a wife in front of and behind her back. She couldn't refute him, so she simply ignored him. She didn't eat the dessert that Shuailan handed to her. Instead, she took another piece and ate slowly. Shuailan didn't get angry. With a smile, he brought the plate of desserts to her. Wife, if you like to eat these, then eat more. Ning Xuemo was annoyed by the public display of affection in front of others. Chapter 1187. Ning Xuemo's heart was beating like thunder at this moment. She opened her eyes wide and looked at the stairs. Her palms suddenly hurt and her whole body went soft. She couldn't help but sit down and almost sat on Shuailan's body. Shuailan pulled her into his embrace and said with a smile, Wife, don't be angry. Let your husband feed you, okay? Ning Xuemo's pressure points were sealed by him and she couldn't move at all. Moreover, when Shuailan hugged her in his embrace, her back was facing the stairs. She couldn't see that place anymore. At this moment, she wanted to slap Shuailan to death. She looked at the culprit with a pair of eyes that seemed to be spitting fire. Shuailan smiled gracefully. Wife, are you angry that your husband was hit on by someone just now? Wife, don't worry. I have no interest in other women. I only love you. He chattered endlessly in Ning Xuemo's ear, spouting sweet nothings. His devilish voice pierced through Ning Xuema's ears, causing her to momentarily be unable to hear the commotion at the top of the stairs. She was very anxious and wanted to prick her ears like a fox to listen. She wanted to tell Shuailan to shut up, but she couldn't make a sound. Everyone's attention was originally on Ning Xuema's table, but when the people who came up the stairs entered, everyone held their breath. What a perfect couple! This was everyone's first reaction when they saw the two people who came in. The guests who came in were a man and a woman. The woman was wearing a snow-white dress. Her face was like a spring flower. Her movements were elegant and calm, with an inexplicable noble air. The man was wearing a moonlight robe. The corner of his robe was painted with a mountain rock and a cold moon. Although his appearance couldn't be seen clearly, his aura was like the clouds in the sky. It made people feel that it was blasphemous to look at him. It was the elusive Master Han Shanyue. 10 years ago, Han Shanyue was worshipped by Lu Hinti as the heavenly master of the vast sky empire. His grand ceremony of worshipping the heavens stunned the citizens of vast sky empire. This great master came and went without a trace. The last time the people of vast sky empire saw him was 10 years ago at the crown prince's wedding. After that, no one knew where he went. Even when it was widely rumored that Ning Xuema had been killed by the devil dwellers in the Sun-Moon Sept, this grandmaster did not appear again. Until 8 years ago, someone saw his whereabouts in the Feixing Kingdom. However, he only appeared for half a day and disappeared again. When Lu Hinti heard that he had appeared, he had sent someone to invite him to save his crazy son. However, he did not expect that before the messenger had even arrived, the master had disappeared again. Now that Lu Hinti had passed away and a new emperor had ascended the throne, what was the purpose of this master's appearance? The people of vast sky empire had a strange feeling towards this great master Han. Originally, they worshipped him as if he was a god and everyone was full of pride. Now that these people thought about the crown prince's ending, it seemed that it was related to this great master. Therefore, although they still worshipped this great master as if he was a god, there was still some resentment. Some people subconsciously bowed to him, while others lowered their heads and drank tea, pretending that they did not see him. It was also because of this that Shuailan and Ning Xuema were still sitting there. It did not seem strange. Although Ning Xuema could not see or hear Shinjiuli, she could roughly guess from the reactions of the people around her. Her heart was burning. There were a few times when she wanted to turn around, but her neck was stiff and she could not turn around. Chapter 1188. Momo, be good. Otherwise, I'll take you away from here. Shuailan sent her a telepathic message. He picked up another pastry and fed it to her. His voice was so gentle that it was almost dripping water. Come, my wife. Try this. The pastry was as sweet as honey and melted instantly in her mouth. But what about her heart? Ning Xuema wanted to cut Shuailan into pieces. This bastard is doing this on purpose. The more anxious I am, the more mischievous he is. Ning Xuema suddenly stopped struggling. Her body relaxed completely and she even swallowed the pastry that he fed her. Shuailan looked down at her and continued to send her a telepathic message. That's a good girl. As long as you're good, I'll take you out a few more times in the future. Ning Xuema ate the pastry slowly and activated all her organs to sense the direction of Shinjiuli and the others. Sir, the cloud tea here tastes really good. Would you like to order a pot to try? Yunshi's voice was gentle and elegant. Oh. Ning Xuema finally heard Shinjiuli say a word. This word made her heart beat violently. It's him. It's really him. It can't be wrong. After 10 years, she finally heard his voice again. Although it was just a short word, it made her want to cry instantly. She didn't know whether he was alive or not for 10 years. Now, she finally heard his voice again. He's still alive. He's still alive. He's still alive. This was Ning Xuemo's thought at this moment. She wanted to turn around again, but Shui Lan raised his hand and held her chin. He looked into her eyes and asked her affectionately, "Is it good?" Ning Xuemo. She suddenly coughed and spat out the pastry in her mouth. It almost sprayed onto Shui Lan's face. Shui Lan raised his sleeve and gently wiped the pastry crumbs off his face. He sent her a telepathic message. "Are you angry? You did it on purpose." Ning Xuemo looked at him provocatively. "That's right, she did it on purpose. She just wanted to spit on his face." Shui Lan sighed softly and said in a soft voice, "You don't have to feel guilty. I don't care." This time, he said it directly, as if he was speaking to everyone in the tea house. In the tea house, a few people who had been paying attention to Shui Lan looked over. They admired him when they saw the half-eaten dessert on his face. This man really doted on his ugly wife. His ugly wife was really blessed. Shui Lan's voice was neither loud nor quiet, so it naturally reached Shinjiuli and Yunqi's ears. Yunqi had always thought highly of herself. Although she appeared gentle and generous on the surface, she actually looked down on ordinary people. Shui Lan had concealed his and Ning Xuemo's aura, so she couldn't recognize them. Yunqi was used to being the center of attention wherever she went, and this time was no different. She hadn't expected that her and Shinjiuli's limelight would be stolen by a mortal couple. Therefore, she also glanced at Shui Lan's table. She only saw Shui Lan's handsome and tall back, while the woman in his arms only revealed half of her body. Furthermore, her back was facing Yunqi, so she couldn't see how ugly she was. She only faintly felt that the woman seemed a little thin and small. This pair of mortal husband and wife were very loving. Weren't they offending public decency by cuddling together while drinking tea here? Yunqi snorted and looked at Shinjiuli, who was sitting opposite her. Shinjiuli gently turned the teacup in his hand. His expression was indifferent, as if he was isolated from the mortal world. The commotion caused by Shui Lan's table only made him glance at it. He then looked away, obviously not taking it to heart. My dear friends, please don't be impatient. Although the content of this book is a little similar to that of my lazy little demon concubine, the content is definitely different. The development trend is also different. It will make you feel especially good. It will make you want to cry and laugh at the same time. My dear friends, are you looking forward to it? Chapter 1189. Yunqi would talk to him softly, and he would occasionally respond. The two of them seemed to be getting along very well. Ning Xuemo had been listening attentively to Shinjiuli's table. After the initial surprise, her heart was filled with doubts. If the Almighty was safe and sound, why hadn't he come looking for her all these years? Could it be that he couldn't find her? Or, although Shui Lan had hidden her extremely well, with the Almighty's abilities, it shouldn't be that he couldn't find her even after 10 years, right? Now, he was with Yunqi again, leisurely drinking tea here. Ha ha ha, men are like this. No matter how good a relationship is, it can't withstand the test of time. He probably forgot about you already, right? You're the only one who's still thinking about him like a fool, waiting for him to come and save you like a knight. The little loli in her mind began to speak again. Shut up. He wouldn't forget about me. Ning Xuemo reprimanded in her mind. Don't try to sow discord here. It must be something I don't know about. Maybe he hadn't stopped looking for her for the past 10 years, or maybe he just couldn't find her, or maybe Shui Lan had purposely made up news of her death. Maybe he had even gotten a fake corpse for the Sun Moon sect to claim and deceive everyone. When the Almighty returned, he might have received news that she was already dead, time was the best medicine for all wounds. Maybe he had been extremely sad when he first received news of her death, but after 10 years, his sadness had faded and he had gotten over it. All sorts of guesses whizzed through Ning Xuema's mind. She had come up with dozens of reasons for him, all of which seemed to be valid and yet none of which seemed to be valid. Her heart felt like it was being pressed down by a huge rock, but it also felt like it was burning with a ball of fire and a block of ice. She couldn't describe the feeling. She felt like a pot of boiling oil in her chest. She wanted to jump in front of Shinjioli and grab his collar to interrogate him, but she also wanted to throw herself into his arms. Your hands and feet are so cold. Are you feeling unwell? Shui Lan held her small hands and asked considerately. Ning Xuema closed her eyes. Her current state made her want to vomit blood. Come, have some hot tea to warm yourself up. Shui Lan brought a cup of tea to her lips. Ning Xuema's eyes darkened. The only thing she could move now was her mouth. Her mouth could only eat and drink, but she couldn't make a sound. She seemed to have accepted her fate. As expected, she lowered her head slightly and leaned closer to the cup of tea. She took a small sip from it. Shui Lan looked at her with a smile. He seemed to appreciate her helpless and frantic look, but a trace of sadness flashed through his eyes. Suddenly, Ning Xuema shook her head violently, and her mouth hit the teacup. This time, she used all the strength she could muster. Shui Lan was obviously caught off guard. The teacup in his hand was knocked over by her and fell to the ground. Paw! The teacup was smashed into smithereens. This movement wasn't small. Especially in this quiet place, it was even more shocking. Almost everyone's gaze was on Shui Lan's table. Shinjioli was no exception. He also glanced at Shui Lan and even looked at Ning Xuema, who was in his arms. Ning Xuema used a lot of strength. Her teeth hurt from the impact. This was the biggest movement she could make. She hoped that Shinjioli would look over here, even if it was just a glance. Although she was in disguise, Shui Lan wasn't. He was only using a camouflage. Chapter 1190. This trick can fool the eyes of ordinary people, but it shouldn't be able to fool Shinjioli. As long as he recognizes Shui Lan, he should be able to think that Shui Lan took her away. Maybe she can be saved. She could sense that Shinjioli's gaze finally fell on her body. At this moment, her palms were sweating nervously. Great God, recognize me. Great God, save me. However, no. Shinjioli didn't react at all. He just glanced at her, but it was just a glance. After half a minute, the tea house was restored to its former calm. To others, this was just an insignificant episode that didn't need to be remembered. But to Ning Xuema, this half a minute felt as long as a century. Her hope gradually turned to despair, her heart gradually sank, as if it had sunk into icy water. She heard the conversation between him and Yunxi again. They were discussing the art of tea together. Although Shinjioli didn't speak much, he would occasionally say a few words. His voice was as cold and elegant as ever. Originally, Ning Xuema only felt at ease when she heard his voice, but now she felt more and more suffocated. Not knowing each other at all. Ning Xuema had imagined the scene of her reunion with the great god countless times, but she never thought of this. Her whole body was ice cold, and the nameless fire in her heart burned several feet high. The little loli's voice sounded in her ears again. Momo, are you willing to be trampled on like this? Turn into a demon. Only by turning into a demon will you be the real you. Only by turning into a demon can you no longer be controlled by others. You can kill those who bullied you and betrayed you. Make them bow down to you. Only then can you live happily. Shut up. Shut up. Shut up. Ning Xuema's fingers clenched tightly. She only felt that her dantian was hot and cold. There was a burst of qi rushing left and right, but it couldn't rush out. It was suffocating in her meridians. Shui Lan originally wanted to continue teasing her, but he suddenly noticed that her body was alternating between hot and cold. Her complexion was extremely strange, and even her forehead was dripping with cold sweat. Shocked, he casually slapped a large ingot of silver on the table, then picked up Ning Xuema and strode away. The commotion at his table attracted some attention, but no one felt anything out of the ordinary. But after they left, they whispered a few words, saying that the ugly woman was lucky to have such a good husband and so on. When Yinshi heard this, she smiled and said to Shinjiuli, "This man looks good, but he doesn't have good taste. He treats an ugly girl like a treasure." Shinjiuli gently raised his hand to take a sip of tea and said indifferently, "Since you treat it as a treasure, there must be a reason for it. Ugliness is nothing but a person's appearance." Yinshi paused, not daring to refute him. Of course, she didn't want to have a small disagreement with Shinjiuli because of this, so she smiled and said, "Sir, you're right. Yunshi was wrong. To humans, ugliness is nothing more than a pink skeleton. In the end, it's just a pile of bones. Appearance is indeed not worth paying attention to." Shinjiuli didn't say anything else. He took another sip of tea and casually glanced in the direction that Shuailan had left. A look of deep thought flashed across his eyes. He didn't know why, but there was a strange feeling in his heart. Ning Xuema didn't expect that under such circumstances, the psychokinesis in her body seemed to have broken through a node and showed signs of upgrading. However, this method of upgrading was extremely painful. Her body felt like it was being cut apart inch by inch and then reassembled. Then, they resumed the scene from before, as if no one had noticed the two of them. The waiter led the old couple to a private room on the second floor in a daze. After serving them a pot of good tea, he left in a daze. Only when he went downstairs did he return to normal. He was so busy that his feet didn't touch the floor. Ning Xuema's body stiffened as Shui Lan helped her step by step up the stairs to the second floor. In the private room on the right at the front, there was a white figure. That white figure was hazy like an immortal, making it hard to see clearly. However, one could see that it was a peerlessly handsome man, and beside him stood a beautiful woman in a light yellow dress. Ning Xuema glanced at them and felt her heart twist. It was as if a row of fine steel needles had pierced her heart, leaving behind countless bloody wounds. Shinjiuli and Yinshi, it was them again. In the past few months, she had been, coincidentally, meeting them more frequently than usual. Chapter 1192. Up until now, they had already, coincidentally, met 3 times. It was almost once a month, which was comparable to her period. She glanced at Shuailan beside her. Needless to say, this person was behind this. This person seemed to have an unusually accurate grasp of Shinjiuli's whereabouts. Every time she came out, she would bump into them coincidentally. "Madam, please take a seat." Shuailan, who was disguised as an old man, helped her sit down in the private room on the left. Shinjiuli paused in the middle of painting. He glanced over at Shinjiuli. Then, he shifted his gaze and continued to paint. Under his brush, a peerless beauty in a light yellow dress gradually took shape. It was so lifelike that it seemed as if the beauty would walk out of the painting with just a breath of air. Every frown and smile was charming. Shuailan pulled Ning Xuema, who had been immobilized, into his arms and fed her intimately. At the same time, Shuailan's languid and magnetic voice rang in Ning Xuema's ears. "Momo, look. Who is Shinjiuli painting? Could it be that you?" Ning Xuema closed her eyes. Her eyesight was excellent, so she had long seen that Shinjioli was painting the woman beside him, Yunshi. Her heart felt like it was being squeezed tightly by someone. She pursed her lips and looked at Shinjioli. This time, Shuailan had finally allowed her to see him face to face. She watched him drink tea, watch him paint, and watch him lazily pass by her in an open carriage. Shuailan had created all sorts of coincidental encounters, but he had never allowed her to talk to Shinjioli. Every time, she would only look at him from afar or close up. And every time she saw him, she would see him with Yunshi. She had met Shinjioli face to face twice, and they had even looked at each other. Unfortunately, he looked at her as if he was looking at a stranger. He only glanced at her once. After a glance, they continued to brush past each other. Shuailan pinched her chin and turned her back. His heart ached as he caressed her lips. At the same time, he used secret voice sending to continue speaking in her mind. Momo, don't be like this. My heart will ache. Ning Shuama tilted her head to avoid his fingers and closed her eyes in silence. Images of Shinjioli flashed through her mind. She remembered the way Shinjioli had looked in the past few days. Momo, open your eyes. Be good. Look, the person you once loved wrongly has already forgotten about you. Furthermore, he has a new lover. Shuailan's voice continued to resound in her heart, each word piercing her heart. Ning Shuama finally opened her eyes in anger and met Shuailan's affectionate and gentle gaze. His gaze was too affectionate, but hers was extremely cold. Momo, forget him. He's not worthy of your love. We're a pair. We were in our previous lives, and we are in this life as well. For all eternity, you'll always be my Momo. Shuailan's voice was full of seduction and determination. Ning Shuama turned her head away, refusing to look at him. Shuailan pinched her chin and gently turned her head back, forcing her to look into his eyes. His eyes were like a pool of spring water, sparkling and translucent, like colored glass that changed unpredictably, bringing with it a sense of seduction as he quietly looked at her. Ning Shuama looked at the white and yellow figures not far away, and her fingers clenched tightly. Almighty, have you really forgotten about me? I'm Shuama, you're Shuama. How could you forget about me? They weren't far apart, and they could see each other if they looked up. However, Ning Shuama felt as if there was an insurmountable gap between them. Chapter 1193. He was just there, painting for the beauty, completely forgetting about her. She was here, bitterly guarding the endless yearning, unable to make a sound. So close, yet 1,000 miles away, truly so close yet so far. After a few months of recuperation, her legs could already walk freely, but she still couldn't truly circulate her cultivation. However, according to her recovery speed, she should be able to fully recover after 3 to 2 months of recuperation. She had already secretly studied the enchantment. Once her legs were completely free, she would be able to break through the enchantment and escape. Right now, she didn't dare to pin her hopes on anyone, and the only person she could count on was herself. The first thing she would do after escaping was to go to the Sun Moon sect, directly meet Shinjioli, and directly ask him about it. She didn't want to make wild guesses. She just wanted to personally get an answer from him. She looked at Shinjioli, watching his figure as he painted. Her eyes flickered slightly, but there wasn't much expression on her face. Shuailan looked at Shinjioli, and then looked at Ning Shuama in his arms. Recently, Ning Shuama had been very quiet. He didn't know if she had finally accepted this reality or if she had other plans in her heart. Ning Shuama was originally very good at hiding her emotions. After being trapped in Shuailan's barrier for 10 years, her skills had reached the point of perfection. Shuailan didn't know what she was thinking at all. He couldn't even tell if she was happy or angry. This made him feel somewhat uncomfortable in his heart. At this moment, he couldn't help but kiss her forehead. "Momo, you are mine." He raised his head and looked not far away, revealing a mysterious smile. Shinjioli seemed to have lost his memories. This was really a good thing for him. He could appear in front of him with Momo without any fear, and Shinjioli could only look at them. Shinjioli's painting hand paused slightly, then he continued painting. He had always been very focused on painting, but this time, he didn't know why, but he kept getting distracted. The person next door had appeared beside him many times. Although he had used a camouflage technique, he could recognize him at a glance. He was a great demon. Shinjioli was not a busybody. As long as the demon did not do anything evil, he could not be bothered. But he always seemed to appear by his side on purpose, bringing a different woman with him every time. But these women all had the same aura, proving that they were the same person, just that they often changed their appearance. More importantly, this woman gave him an inexplicable sense of familiarity. Seeing how intimate the two were, Shinjioli felt a little uncomfortable. He always felt that the person beside the big demon should be his. Moreover, the smile that the greater demon gave him seemed to be filled with provocation. This made him feel even more uncomfortable. He could see that the power of the woman beside Shuailan was not low. He could also see that her acupoints had been sealed. She seemed to be forced to stay beside the big demon. But he had always disdained to meddle in other people's business, and was too lazy to ask. There were too many injustices in this world, and he was not a hero who would do trivial good deeds. He had his own code of conduct and would not make an exception for an ordinary person. But, was that woman really an ordinary person? Ning Xuema quietly avoided Shuailan's hand and closed her eyes again. Since she couldn't change anything for the time being, she didn't need to look at the two people to provoke herself and make a fool of herself in front of Shuailan. She would return to Shinjioli's side. Then she would understand everything. She would also not let go of the main culprit, Wuemo. Chapter 1194. Momo, do you know? The way you look right now makes people want to kiss you. Shuailan moved closer to her, his lips touching her earlobe. Although she was disguised as an old woman, it was only an ordinary disguise. Her aura was still the same. There was a faint fragrance on her body that seemed to be naturally produced from her skin. It was as seductive as a poppy flower. Ning Xuema impolitely extended her hand and pushed him away, sending him a single word, "Scram." Shuailan immediately held her hand. Although her hand looked rough, it was still as firm and soft as a young girl's. He gently kissed her fingertips and said, "Momo, have you ever heard of the saying, hitting is affection, scolding is love?" Every time this bastard came out, he would tease her. No matter what kind of disguise she was disguised as, he could always pretend to be affectionate. This made Ning Xuema want to send him flying with a slap. Now that he looked like an old man, wasn't he afraid that the surrounding people would be shocked to see him teasing an old woman with a wrinkled face? How many goosebumps would she get? Was it really fun to treat sappiness as fun? Ning Xuema was about to take the risk of him tearing off a layer of her skin to withdraw her hand when she suddenly heard a gust of wind. A silver-white light flashed without any warning. It went straight for Shuailan's forehead. This time, Shuailan was completely unprepared. He couldn't block it and subconsciously fell backwards. Suddenly, he felt his arms suddenly empty. Ning Xuema, who had been in his arms all this time, was suddenly snatched away by someone. This sudden change happened too fast, so fast that no one could react. Even lightning couldn't compare to its speed. Ning Xuema didn't react in time. Her vision blurred, and she suddenly felt her body become light. Then, she fell into a familiar embrace. A faint, cold fragrance seeped into her nose. It was the same feeling as before. Ning Xuema's breath caught. She looked up and saw a handsome face. It was Shinjioli. Shinjioli, who had just been leisurely painting, had actually saved her. Her heart was pounding uncontrollably and her mind was buzzing. Could it be that he recognized him? Did he recognize him? Let her go. Shui Lan was furious. Shinjioli, this bastard, didn't play by the rules. Shouldn't he be showing off his love with Yunqi all the time? Shouldn't he be finishing his painting? Shouldn't he not be able to see anything and continue doing his own thing? Why did he suddenly come to snatch her away? What's more, he had snatched a wrinkled old lady. This was simply history repeating itself. Shui Lan jumped up almost without thinking. A red light flew towards Shinjioli. This time, he used a killing move right from the start. He was no longer an ignorant person. His martial arts had improved a lot. If he fought seriously, he should be able to teach Shinjioli a lesson. Shinjioli hugged Ningxuemo with his left arm and raised his right hand to release a white light. The light collided. It was dazzling and powerful at the same time, like a comet hitting the moon. Countless shock waves spread in all directions. If Shinjioli hadn't immediately set up a barrier before making his move, the entire tea house would have been raised and everyone would have been thrown into the air. Shinjioli didn't want to continue fighting. His figure rose and he flew out of the tea house like a graceful swan. Leave her behind. Shui Lan shouted. He didn't care about hurting the stunned onlookers as he turned into a red light and chased after Shinjioli. This sudden turn of events shocked Yunqi so much that her eyeballs almost fell out. Chapter 1195. Just a moment ago, she had been sitting there with her heart full of happiness. She had asked Shinjioli to paint her and watched as the person in the painting slowly took shape. Her heart was overflowing with joy. She had not expected that Shinjioli, who had been focused on painting her, would suddenly turn around and attack an elderly couple. He even snatched the old woman and ran away. Yunqi was petrified on the spot for a full minute before she regained her senses. She vaguely remembered that 10 years ago, Shinjioli had also snatched an old woman. Her expression darkened. She picked up the unfinished painting and rushed out. Only the people in the tea house were left looking at each other. What was going on? Master Han Shanhua had actually abandoned his beautiful female companion to snatch an old woman and run away. Shinjioli stopped at a spacious area and placed Ningxuemo in a safe place. He unsealed her acupoints and was about to turn around when she suddenly pulled on his sleeve. He did not like to interact too much with strangers, but Shinjioli frowned slightly. In the end, he did not shake off her hand. In the distance, Shui Lan was flying towards them like a bullet. Put her down. Ningxuemo glanced sideways at Shui Lan, then looked up at Shinjioli. She did not want to let go of his hand. She did not want to be separated for more than 10 years in the blink of an eye. However, it would be inconvenient for the Almighty to carry her in a fight. She took a deep breath and looked at him. Her gaze was complicated and difficult to decipher. It seemed to contain thousands of words. Finally, her lips moved slightly. Almighty, be careful. She had not spoken for a long time. At this moment, she suddenly spoke with a slightly strange tone. Shinjioli suddenly felt a sense of familiarity. However, this feeling was fleeting. In the end, he calmly withdrew his sleeve and nodded slightly. He turned around and faced Shui Lan's storm-like attack. Shui Lan was about to go crazy. He would never forget the humiliation of having his favorite stolen from him. Not to mention that this person had robbed him several times in a row. He raised his hand, and the blood-red mist covered the sky and covered the earth like a tide. Wherever the red mist went, there were no longer any living things. The flowers and plants were withering and rotting at a speed visible to the naked eye. Within the red mist, there were countless insects the size of rice grains moving, Shinjuli's thin lips curled up slightly. He spun the jade flute in his hand, and a huge silver barrier appeared, protecting him, Ningxiuemo, and Yunxi. When the red mist came into contact with the barrier, it was as if it had come into contact with strong sulfuric acid. With a sizzling sound, the insects fell to the ground. Shinjuli made a hand seal, and the clear sky was suddenly filled with dark clouds. Following that, countless bolts of lightning fell from the sky like a dazzling and resplendent meteor shower. Sparks flew in all directions. When the lightning fell, the intense white light was as bright as day. It was so dazzling that people couldn't open their eyes. Rumbling sounds continuously rang in their ears. Ningxiuemo felt as if hundreds of atomic bombs were exploding beside her. Shuilan's body flickered as he raised his speed to the maximum. Only then did he barely manage to dodge these fatal lightning bolts. However, there were simply too many of these lightning bolts. Furthermore, they were arranged according to a certain spell formation, so he was still struck by a few of them. Even though he had a protective barrier, he was still shaken and spat out a few mouthfuls of blood. Shuilan's heart sank. Shinjuli's cultivation seemed to have improved quite a bit. He seemed to be in peak condition right now. It would be difficult for Shuilan to resist him. This time, it seemed like it would be difficult for Shuilan to gain an advantage. However, if he retreated now, he would be giving up Ningxiuemo. Chapter 1196. Shuilan thought to himself as he dealt with the situation. He would never allow Shinjuli to take Momo away from him again. A red light flashed in his eyes, and the corners of his lips were stained with blood. The smile on his face finally disappeared, replaced by a fierce look. His red robe fluttered without any wind. He stretched out his hand and drew a door in the air. The door was completely black, and the sunlight seemed to have been absorbed. It did not reflect any light at all. The door was engraved with complicated patterns and strange beasts. At this moment, the door slowly opened, the red light expanded bit by bit, countless ghosts and monsters rushed out from the door, grinning maliciously as they pounced. The originally cloudless sky was completely covered by the black gas, as if the night had suddenly arrived. Although Ningxiuemo knew that Shuilan was a devil, this was the first time she had seen him make a move like this. This scene had appeared countless times in her previous life, making her feel as if she had returned to the era of Shuiemo, ha 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 ha. That's right, Momo. Do you see? This is a devil. This is what you should be like in the future. They should be your subordinates. The loli's voice sounded in her mind again. Ningxiuemo could almost see the little loli's proud expression. Following the little loli's voice, she suddenly had the urge to rush forward and sniff the black gas. She and Yunxi were currently protected by Shinjuli in a spherical barrier. She was originally sitting, but now she could not help but stand up. Ningxiuemo. Yunxi suddenly transmitted her voice. Ningxiuemo subconsciously turned to look at her. Yunxi's expression changed slightly. It's really you. You're not dead. Ningxiuemo smiled. What? Are you that eager for me to die? Her smile seemed to have a sinister ghost aura. The wrinkles on her face were all wrinkled together, and her extremely black eyes seemed to be surging with a red light. Yunxi's heart inexplicably turned cold. This kind of Ningxiuemo actually made her feel cold all over. However, her psychokinesis cultivation was profound. She moved her fingertips and formed a spell. You've been possessed by the devil. Ningxiuemo's tyrannical nature surged within her, giving her the urge to destroy everything. He especially wanted to destroy Yunxi. However, Yunxi's words were like a sudden clap of thunder that struck Ningxiuemo's head and startled her. Possessed by the devil. How could this be? She wouldn't fall for that little loli's trick. He wouldn't turn into a demon. She was Ning Xuemo, not anyone else. She bit the tip of her tongue. The sharp pain woke her up. She took a deep breath and glared coldly at Yunxi. You are the one who has been possessed. Yunxi, she then looked at Ning Xuemo. Her face was tense as she looked in the direction of the battlefield. There was no other aura around her. It was as if the extreme yin and extreme cold pressure was just an illusion. She stared blankly. Could she have been mistaken? She secretly sensed Ning Xuemo's aura again. She had a normal aura, but there was also a trace of immortal aura. Yunxi's heart skipped a beat as she blurted out, "You've actually cultivated to Earth rank level 8? Ning Xuemo didn't even look at her as she replied indifferently, "I think your attention shouldn't be on me." Yunxi choked. Only then did she remember that Xinjiuli and Shuailan were fighting. She hurriedly looked at the battlefield again. Then, she clenched her fist slightly. Was this the gates of hell? Was this devil crazy? Once the gates of hell were opened, thousands of ghosts would come out in full force and the human world would become a purgatory. This would definitely be a disaster for the world. Chapter 1197. Sir, you have to seal this hell's gate. Yunxi shouted from within the barrier. Xinjiuli obviously knew this as well. He frowned slightly and waved his sleeves to kill the ghosts that were pouncing on him. He finally understood what Shuailan was trying to do. These ghosts couldn't harm Xinjiuli at all, but it was definitely a terrible nightmare for the people in this city. This great demon wanted to use the lives of the people in this city to hold him back so that he could find an opportunity to snatch Ning Xuemo away. This great demon seemed to be going all out. He sent a ray of white light carrying a strong purifying power over and enveloped the gate, forcibly stopping it from expanding. Half of the demons that came out were enveloped by the purifying power. They screamed miserably as they turned into ashes. However, there were now hundreds and thousands of demons and ghosts floating outside. Some of them pounced on Xinjiuli, while others took the opportunity to flee into the city. Xinjiuli waved his hand, and a guqin suddenly appeared in front of him. He sat down cross-legged and began to play. The sound of the guqin was like a gentle Buddhist chant. It was as gorgeous as heavenly flowers and as gentle as the spring breeze in March. It made people feel comfortable and had a strong purifying power. Wherever it passed, it dissolved the winter's ice and dissipated the demonic aura floating in the air. Wherever the sound of the guqin passed, all the demons and ghosts covered their ears in pain, struggling and howling. Shuailan was naturally affected by the sound of the guqin. His body swayed slightly as he looked at Xinjiuli with a murderous gaze. Suddenly, a blue guqin appeared in front of him. His jade-like fingers gently stroked it, and waves of mournful demonic sounds were constantly heard. The two peerless experts were fighting. Yunxi could only stand to the side. She couldn't interfere at all. Ning Xuemo's telekinesis was completely sealed. Fortunately, she was inside the barrier set up by Xinjiuli. This barrier had the effect of blocking the demonic sounds, so she didn't suffer much from the impact. However, it was strange. Although she didn't like Shuailan's music, she also felt uncomfortable when she heard Xinjiuli's Buddhist chants. Subconsciously, she didn't like listening to it. In her mind, the little loli screamed, "So noisy! So noisy! Stop playing!" This little loli seemed to be unable to hear the purifying sound. Ning Xuemo was overjoyed. She originally wanted to cover her ears and not listen to any music. However, at this moment, she endured it. Not only did she not cover her ears, but she also subconsciously tried to catch Xinjiuli's music. Beside her, Yunxi secretly clenched her fists as a thought ran through her mind. Should he take this opportunity to get rid of Ning Xuemo? As long as she was alive, there was a possibility that Xinjiuli would fall into a trap again. it was not easy for him to wait for this day. It was not easy for him to be able to stay by Shinjuli's side like a friend again. She clenched her fists. Ning Xuema was very sensitive. Although Yunshi hadn't made a move yet, she had already sensed the faint murderous aura coming from her. Her heart sank slightly. Her cultivation hadn't recovered yet, and Shinjuli had only unsealed her mute acupoint. Her current ability was that of an ordinary person's. If Yunshi made a move on her now, she was afraid that she wouldn't have a chance to survive. She glanced at Yunshi and suddenly smiled. "You want to kill me?" Yunshi, who had been in a dilemma, was about to use her ultimate move. However, when she heard Ning Xuema's words, she was shocked and turned her head to look at her. She saw that Yunshi was smiling, but her eyes were bright, as if she had seen through all the dirty thoughts in her heart. Chapter 1198. If you have the confidence to kill me in one blow, then go ahead. Ning Xuema was still smiling, but her eyes were sharp. But do you think you have the ability to do so? Yunshi choked, and her eyes darkened. She could only see that Ning Xuema had cultivated to Earth rank level 8, but she didn't see that Ning Xuema's telekinesis was still sealed. Ning Xuema had always been crafty in battle. Back then, she had defeated an Earth rank level 5 expert with her telekinesis at Earth rank level 2. Not only had this news spread throughout the Sun Moon sect, but it had also reached Yunshi's ears. Although Yunshi had cultivated to Heaven rank level 1, her actual combat skills were still not strong, so the chances of her fighting with others were very low. She really didn't have the confidence to kill Ning Xuema, who was already at Earth rank level 8, in one blow. If it had been a sneak attack, it would have been possible. However, Ning Xuema, who was more cunning than a fox, had already sensed her intentions and was definitely on guard. Even if she attacked 10 times, she might not be able to do anything to her. Instead, it would make the D-Zune suspicious. Yunshi had already figured out the pros and cons. She loosened her fingers slightly and glanced at Ning Xuema. "You think too much. My sword has never been aimed at the innocent." She took the initiative to find a way out of this embarrassing situation. While she was at it, she also belittled Ning Xuema. Ning Xuema smiled and said leisurely, "My sword also won't casually attack unrelated people. We are in the same boat." Yunshi was speechless. Her pretty face turned green and white. She had never been Ning Xuema's opponent when it came to bickering. She clenched her fists in her sleeves and finally smiled faintly. She said proudly, "This fairy won't lower herself to the same level as a mortal." Ning Xuema sat there, looking more leisurely than Yunshi. "If you have the time to talk nonsense with me, why don't you go help the great god?" Yunshi was speechless. She looked at the battlefield again. The two experts had already fought until the sky turned dark, and the sun and moon lost their light. The two guqin sounds were like water ripples, constantly colliding in the air. In the sky, intense white and red lights intersected and reflected each other. The sound was like thunder, exploding in all directions. Those fiendish demons naturally became cannon fodder. Those who were affected by the zither music were reduced to ashes. Ning Xuema felt as if she was bathing in the spring breeze for one moment, and then her heart suddenly clenched. It was as if there was a string in her heart that was constantly being pulled and loosened again. Yunshi glanced at Ning Xuema. She wanted to show off her abilities in front of Ning Xuema to intimidate her. She stood up and waved her arms like flowers blooming. A wave of pale silver light rushed towards the black, illusory demons that were escaping in the air. In just a moment, she had eliminated 2 or 3 of them. Shuilan, who had already been on the losing end, realized that he had no chance of winning when he saw Yunshi make a move. He spat out a mouthful of blood, and his guqin music was no longer in tune. Meanwhile, Shinjuli's Guqin attack had already arrived. It broke Shuailan's protective barrier and directly affected his body. When he was hit by the powerful purifying power, his body flew out like a kite with a broken string. He almost crashed into Ning Xuemo's barrier. Shuailan fell to the ground, his eyes meeting Ning Xuemo's. Ning Xuemo's eyes were so dark that he couldn't see her emotions at all. They had been together for 10 years. Now that he had gotten hurt because of her, he couldn't see any trace of heartache in her eyes. His heart suddenly felt stifled. A mouthful of blood surged up again, but he forced it back down. In the past 10 years, Shinjuli had indeed recovered his body to its peak condition. Chapter 1199. At this moment, she shouldn't face him head-on. There would be more opportunities in the future, so there was no need to fight to the death here. Shuailan had always been good at judging the situation, so he made a decision in the blink of an eye. He laughed and said, "Momo, do your best. I will wait for your good news." He took one last look at Ning Xuemo before he turned into a red light and left. Ning Xuemo was speechless. This bastard still wanted to trick her before he left. She looked at Shinjuli. Shinjuli casually glanced at Shuailan, who had already turned into a dot, but he didn't chase after him. He lifted his sleeve and removed the barrier surrounding Ning Xuemo's body before lowering his eyes to look at her. When their gazes met, Ning Xuemo's heart thumped wildly, but she still smiled at him. "Do you believe his words?" Shinjuli looked into her ink-black eyes, and his heart trembled. There was always an inexplicable closeness between them, and that strange feeling of wanting to protect her surged up again. Yunshi said, "Dizwa, this woman has been with that great demon all this time." What he said before he left might have some hidden meaning. "You have to be careful." Her righteous words were stuck in her throat before she could finish speaking. This was because Shinjuli actually bent down and picked up Ning Xuemo again before leaving with the wind. Yunshi was speechless. She was left hanging there with the painting Shinjuli had made for her in her arms. The wind was biting cold, but Ning Xuemo couldn't feel the wind at all. It was all blocked outside by Shinjuli's barrier. At this moment, Shinjuli was hugging her with one arm around her waist. This made Ning Xuemo feel as though she had returned to the days of the past. At that time, the Almighty had not lost contact with her, and they were deeply in love with each other. Ning Xuemo raised her eyes and looked at Shinjuli. His side profile was still as handsome as a celestial being, but his expression was extremely distant, as if he was a god who was far away. Shinjuli lowered his head to look at her. Seeing the complicated look in her eyes, he said lightly, "What's your name?" Ning Xuemo was stunned and her eyes darkened. He really didn't remember her. Amnesia, the Almighty actually lost his memory. No wonder he hadn't come looking for her. No wonder he had become friends with Yunshi again. So that was the reason. Such a melodramatic thing actually happened to the Almighty. Ning Xuemo didn't know whether to laugh or cry. However, her doubts for many years were finally solved. Did he forget about her? That's fine. She would let him get to know her again. She said, "Ning Xuemo. Shua as in white snow, mo as in stranger." After saying this, she looked at his expressionless face and couldn't help but add, "Almighty, you really don't remember me? You don't remember anything at all?" Shinjuli raised his eyebrows slightly. "Almighty?" Ning Xuemo nodded and looked at him as she replied, "I used to call you that before, but I'm used to it now. I didn't know you had forgotten. You asked me to wait for you for half a month, but in the end, I waited for 10 whole years." Shinjuli's eyes flickered. After a while, he calmly looked away. "Since that's the case, you can call me how you used to call me now. Who were you to me in the past?" Ning Xuema was stunned and didn't know how to answer this question. Say that I'm his wife. Although the Almighty was very close to her, he didn't say that he wanted to marry her. In the end, he didn't give her a clear answer. Furthermore, they didn't have any physical contact. Without any evidence, how could she prove that she was his wife? Chapter 1200. So if she said, I'm your concubine. She was disgusted by this form of address from the bottom of her heart, so she definitely wouldn't say it out loud. Then she could only say that she was his disciple. Ning Xuema was silent for a moment, and finally said, Disciple, I'm your direct disciple. Shinjioli glanced at her lightly, and felt that something was wrong. Was she only his disciple? When he had just returned to the Sun-Moon sect, Yilu Jing, and had once knelt and begged for forgiveness, saying that she had lost little junior sister, and even caused her to die without a complete corpse, and so on. He didn't have any impression of this last disciple of his, so he only nodded indifferently, and didn't even ask for her name. This matter was considered to be over. In these 2 years, he had never thought about this last disciple. It was just that when he dreamed about it in the middle of the night, he would always feel a sense of emptiness, as if he had lost something important. Of course, he had never taken anything to heart, and he also didn't feel that there was anything he needed to pay special attention to. So he very well dispelled those kinds of emotions, and continued to live his life as it was originally. These 2 years were as peaceful as water, until the moment he met Shuailan. When he first met Shuailan, he already knew that he was a great demon, but he didn't see him do evil, so he didn't take it to heart and didn't even look at him. When Shuailan saw him, he had a guarded expression, and from that expression, he seemed to recognize him. Shinjioli thus determined that this great demon had once interacted with him, and from the other's expression, those interactions weren't friendly. Later on, he accidentally bumped into Shuailan a few times, but didn't make any deeper movements. Then he saw Shuailan bring Ning Xuema out. Although he only glanced, and didn't even see the other's face clearly, he could sense that there wasn't any demonic qi on the other's body, and should be a pure human. Shuailan was extraordinarily considerate to this human, feeding, hugging, and talking close to her face. Although it was taboo for humans and demons to fall in love, it wasn't too big of a taboo. Only young Taoist priests who were bored out of their wits would meddle in this matter. Shinjioli didn't intend to meddle in this matter. However, he felt that there was something special about that human. When he saw Shuailan acting so intimately with her, he couldn't help but feel uncomfortable. However, he had always hidden his emotions well, so Shuailan and the others couldn't tell. Then, he realized that Shuailan would often bring that human to meet him on various occasions. Especially when he was with Yunshi, the frequency of him bumping into Shuailan and the others was simply unbelievable. Clearly, this was no longer a chance encounter, but a deliberate act by the other party. Although Shinjioli didn't know what Shuailan was up to, he was sure that every time Shuailan was intimate with that woman, he felt more and more uncomfortable, as if something that originally belonged to him had been snatched away. At first, he wasn't sure if this feeling was an illusion, so he started to consciously attract Shuailan to bring Ning Xuema out. As a result, he and Yunshi met more frequently, and they usually met at places that they frequented, such as tea houses and so on. He knew that once Shuailan found out about this, he would definitely bring Ning Xuema over. Shuailan didn't disappoint him, and this time, he brought Ning Xuema over again. Although he had been painting, part of his attention was diverted to Ning Xuema. Chapter 1201. Shinjioli could feel that Ning Xuema's gaze was constantly on him. She was also repulsed by Shuailan's intimacy with her. This woman was forced. She wasn't willing to be with Shuailan. When he realized this, he actually felt very gratified. At the beginning of this operation, he had already decided to snatch her away. Now that she was finally in his arms, he actually didn't feel very uncomfortable hugging her like this. There was a faint fragrance on her body, and he felt very comfortable just by smelling it. He looked at her old face and felt that something was wrong. What's your original appearance? Just like now. Every time Shui Lan brought her out, he would change her appearance. It was different every time. However, there was one thing in common. Her appearance had always been old and ugly. She was like a withered green leaf, which set off Shui Lan's big red flower very well. After seeing so many, Shinjuli felt that this woman shouldn't be beautiful. Maybe she was really old. After all, it would take at least 50 to 60 years for a human to cultivate to Earth rank level 8. Therefore, this woman should be around 70 to 80 years old. It was reasonable for her to look older. Ning Xuema raised her eyebrows. Original appearance. What a joke, she wasn't that old. She quickly shook her head. This isn't my original appearance. Shui Lan changed my appearance. Then what's your original appearance? Older than now. Shinjuli was a little curious. Ning Xuema was speechless. She said bluntly, how is that possible? My original appearance is that of a 16-year-old beauty. I'm very beautiful. She looked at him again. I'm not much worse than you, Guru. This woman wasn't just confident, she was even a little narcissistic, but it wasn't disgusting. Yunxi finally caught up from behind. She was stepping on a cloud, so her speed wasn't as fast as Shinjuli's. She could only shout from behind, Julie, wait for me. Ning Xuema's body stiffened. Julie. What an intimate form of address. She vaguely remembered that Yunxi had always addressed the Almighty as Dizwa and Sir outside. When had she become so close to the Almighty? Shinjuli felt the body of the person in his arms stiffen. He lowered his head and glanced at her. Ning Xuema, however, looked away and did not look at him. Sensing that Shinjuli's speed had slowed down, Yunxi's tensed face finally broke into a smile. Julie, I knew you would wait for me. The two of them were running neck to neck. Julie, what Shui Lan said just now seems to have a hidden meaning. Yunxi clearly did not want to give up on this opportunity. What mystery? Shinjuli finally spoke, his face still expressionless. Yunxi said, he told this girl to work hard. Does this mean that this girl is his spy? After all, the demon realm seems to be showing signs of trouble again. We have to be on guard. Shinjuli glanced at Yunxi lightly. Have you ever seen anyone instruct their spy in front of others? Yunxi was speechless. Perhaps this is that guy's trick. He's playing hard to get. He's deliberately doing the opposite, she wouldn't. Shinjuli lowered his head and glanced at Ning Xuema. He was certain of this in his heart. Yunxi was speechless. She couldn't say anything more. If she said anything more, Shinjuli would be disgusted. When Yunxi saw Ning Xuema in Shinjuli's arms, a dark glint flashed across her eyes. She tilted her head and said, perhaps I'm thinking too much. Miss Ning wouldn't. Julie, put Miss Ning on my cloud. This way. Chapter 1202. Shinjuli suddenly asked, Miss Ning. Do you know her? Yunxi froze. She had only wanted to prevent Shinjuli from hugging Ning Xuema and had let it slip out of her mouth in a moment of panic. She could only nod. Yes, Julie. Isn't she your disciple? Shinjuli asked again, is this her original appearance? Yunxi froze. After a while, she said, no. Shinjuli glanced at her and continued, then how do you know she is my disciple? Yunxi felt cold sweat trickling down her forehead. She had assumed that it was Ning Xuema because only Ning Xuema could make Shinjuli so nervous. Furthermore, when Shui Lan had abducted Ning Xuema, they had disguised themselves as an elderly couple. Therefore, she had called her Miss Ning without hesitation. However, she couldn't tell Shinjuli this reason. Shinjuli had finally forgotten Ning Xuemo. She couldn't let him recall his feelings for Ning Xuemo. She had an idea and pretended not to understand. Yunxi, I heard that Shui Lan abducted your disciple Ning Xuemo. Therefore, Julie, the person you rescued was naturally Miss Ning. Shinjuli glanced at her but didn't say anything. Yunxi didn't know if he believed her or not. After waiting for a long time, she didn't hear any response from him. He should have believed her, right? She glanced at Ning Xuemo again and felt that the way she nestled in Shinjuli's arms was really annoying. Therefore, she repeated herself. Julie, put Miss Ning on my cloud. Miss Ning is a woman after all. What Yunxi said made sense. According to the rules of the secular world, men and women shouldn't touch each other. As her master, he really shouldn't be hugging his female disciple. However, he lowered his head and looked at Ning Xuemo in his arms, who seemed to be thinking about something. Was she really just a disciple? Shinjuli carefully looked at Ning Xuemo in his arms. After looking at her for a long time, he was sure she still wanted to hug him. Thus, he said indifferently, no need. Ning Xuemo finally glanced at Yunxi. With one glance, she knew what this woman was thinking. Yunxi was still too young, so her emotions were written all over her face. Ning Xuemo snuggled deeper into the Almighty's embrace. She found a comfortable position and stopped moving. Yunxi, the three of them sped back to the Sun-Moon sect. Shinjuli suddenly asked, Xuemo, where do you live? He called out Xuemo so naturally, as if he had called her countless times. That was indeed the case. Ning Xuemo was stunned for a moment before she answered honestly, Tianyin Peak. Shinjuli pondered for a moment but he didn't say anything. He just carried Ning Xuemo up the Tianyin Peak. Ning Xuemo raised her eyebrows slightly when she saw that Yunxi had followed them shamelessly. She glanced at her and then looked away. The Tianyin Peak was still the same. The only difference was that one had lost her memories, while the other's state of mind had changed. Shinjuli put her down and said indifferently, go back to your room. Everything seemed to have returned to square one. The Almighty had become cold again. It didn't matter. She could just make him fall in love with her again. Patience was something she didn't lack. Plus, the Almighty wasn't repulsed by her approach, right? This was a good sign. Ning Xuemo nodded. Just as she was about to turn and leave, the Almighty's voice was heard from behind her. Wash your face and come see me again. There was a hint of disdain in his tone. Ning Xuemo. She hadn't turned into an old lady on purpose. Chapter 1203. Ning Xuemo returned to her side chamber. Looking at the familiar yet strange room in front of her, she was slightly stunned. She had left this place for more than 10 years. It had been so long that she had almost forgotten the layout of her room. She was already used to waking up in Shui Lan's gorgeous Red Devil Palace. Every day, she would face Shui Lan's deep affection and engage in a tug-of-war with her inner demons every night. Then she would miss the Almighty endlessly. Those days were not Ning Xuemo's toughest days, but they were her darkest days. In the Devil Palace, her inner demons would disturb her every night, screaming that she had cursed Shinjuli to death. Her determination was shaken, and bit by bit, her inner defenses were broken. Finally, she pulled through. She waited until Shinjuli came to save her. Although he had already forgotten about her. But to be able to see him again, to be able to throw herself into his arms again, was a gift from the heavens. She looked around again. The hall was black and white, and the old things that she used to use were all gone. They must have been thrown away by someone. The hall was so cold that there was no sign of life. She clenched her fists. Who was the one who threw her things away? Was it the Almighty? Or Wuimo? Thinking of the substitute of the Almighty, she felt anger in her heart again. Wuimo was still alive after killing her. Relying on the fact that the Almighty had lost his memory, he probably did not receive any punishment and was still living well. She stood in front of the dressing table and looked at the old face in the mirror. She was speechless. Shuailan, this bastard, always disguised her to be so ugly. Fortunately, the disguise this time was not the kind that was difficult to undo for the first time. Ning Xuema could easily undo it herself. As she slowly removed the fake skin, her original delicate face was finally revealed. Ning Xuema looked at herself in the mirror and remained silent. The person in the mirror was still beautiful and elegant, but those lively eyes were now filled with fatigue and vicissitudes of life. She had not slept well for 10 years, moreover, she had become much quieter. Facing the Almighty, she originally had a lot to say, but she could not say a single word. Shuailan imprisoned her in the Devil Palace. She did not even have anyone to talk to. The only person she could talk to was Shuailan, but Ning Xuema did not want to talk to him. Therefore, she became more and more silent and indifferent. This problem could not be cured in a short period of time, but, as long as she was by the Almighty's side, she would slowly recover. When she finished washing herself, her heart, which had been silent for 10 years, finally, her heart, which had been silent for 10 years. Everything had happened too quickly. Before she could react, she had already been taken away by the Almighty to the Tianyin Peak. Now that she had to face Shinjiuli, whom she had not seen for 10 years, her nervousness, excitement, joy, and grievance finally came back. They turned into a torrent that rushed into her heart. She could not help but touch her face. She was 14 years old when she left him, but now she was 24 years old. She was born with the appearance of a lowly, and because of her early success in cultivation, her appearance was not much different from 10 years ago. The only difference was that she was taller and had a devilish figure. She wondered how he would react when he saw the real her. He used to like her so much. If he saw her real appearance, even if he had lost his memory, he should still have some impression of her, right? Chapter 1204. Maybe he would remember and regain his memories, 10 years of lovesickness and torment. Now that they were reunited, she really wanted to rush into his arms and tell him all the grievances and longings she had suffered all these years. She wanted to cry in his arms. She wanted him to hug her and comfort her, just like 10 years ago when he had gently stroked her hair and told her, "Xuema, I'm here." Her heart almost flew into her chest, but her feet were rooted to the ground. How was she going to face Shinjiuli, who had lost his memories? Her heart was full of bitter longing. Would he not feel anything at all? For the first time, Ning Xuema acted like an ordinary woman. Her imagination ran wild, and she kept denying herself. Finally, she stepped into the main hall. The main hall was very quiet. Ning Xuema could only hear her own footsteps. Each step seemed to step on her heart, causing her soul to tremble continuously. It was a mixture of excitement, nervousness, uneasiness, and joy. Ning Xuema felt that her heart was about to jump out of her chest. She took a deep breath. She was going to see the Almighty soon. Calm down, Ning Xuema. Show your composure as a secret agent boss. Don't act like a shy little girl who doesn't know much about the world. Turning around the screen, Ning Xuema felt as if she had been doused with ice water from head to toe. She clenched her hands tightly and tried not to lose her composure. This was normal. Shinjiuli and Yunshi were sitting opposite each other with a game of chess in front of them. Yunshi looked a little distressed and pouted unconsciously. "Jiuli, can't you just let me have a handicap? Just one." Shinjiuli tapped his fingers on the chessboard. Yunshi, don't regret your moves. The Almighty and Yunshi were friends. Wasn't it normal for them to play chess together? However, this feeling was really terrible. The Almighty had asked her to find him after bathing. She had been longing to have a long talk with the Almighty after a long separation. She had been extremely nervous about it. However, the Almighty obviously didn't take her seriously. He didn't plan to meet her alone. Plus, he got along very well with Yunshi. This made her previous nervousness, agitation, and uneasiness seem laughable. She pursed her lips and suppressed the churning emotions in her heart. Almighty, I'm here. Shinjioli casually glanced at her and said indifferently, pour the tea. Ning Shuemo. She lowered her eyes to look at the dress she was wearing and then at her hands. She hadn't dressed up properly for 10 years, but after she came back this time, she dressed up meticulously. Her hair was combed into a complicated and beautiful flowing cloud bun. Because the closet was empty, she couldn't find any clothes that she could wear. So, she used a transformation technique to transform the old clothes she was wearing into a long fluttering dress. She tried her best to make herself beautiful so that even if he was not stunned by her beauty, he would at least take a few more glances at her. He did not expect that, he only glanced at her once. It was still an extremely indifferent glance, no different from looking at a piece of furniture in the house. He didn't have any intention of being stunned and naturally ordered her to do things. Ning Shuema suppressed the disappointment in her heart and walked forward. She picked up the teapot and silently poured a cup of tea for Shinjioli. Just as she was about to put the teapot back, she heard his voice again. In the same indifferent tone, he said, "Do you still need me to teach you how to pour tea for Yunshi?" Pour tea for Yunshi. Ning Shuema's body stiffened. She tightened her grip on the teapot. Chapter 1205. After a while, she heard herself say, "Yes, master." Her voice was monotonous. Yunshi looked at her with a smug expression. Shinjioli glanced at Ning Shuema. He seemed a little puzzled as to why she had suddenly changed the way she addressed him. However, he didn't say anything and continued playing chess. Ning Shuema lowered her gaze and poured a cup of tea for Yunshi. She suddenly recalled the time when she had played chess with Yunshi and he had poured a cup of viburnum spring tea for her. The fragrance had filled the air. Through the spiraling fragrance of the tea, she had seen Shinjioli's gentle face. While she had been distracted, she had poured too much water into the teapot and it had overflowed a little. The water had splashed onto Yunshi's yellow dress. Yunshi gasped softly and looked at Shinjioli with an aggrieved expression. "Jioli, this is my favorite dress." Ning Shuema looked at her coldly without saying anything. Shinjioli frowned slightly and looked at Ning Shuema with a scrutinizing gaze. "What's wrong with you? Can't you do something like this properly?" He had actually reprimanded her because of Yunshi. She had already been treated like a servant and poured tea for Yunshi. She hadn't expected to be reprimanded because of Yunshi. Ning Shuema's heart ached. Then, a nameless flame burst out. She put down the teapot in her hand and smashed it on the chessboard with a loud bang. She had used so much force that more than half of the hot tea had spilled out. The hot water had instantly scalded her hands, but she didn't seem to feel anything. Instead, she flashed a fake smile at the two people sitting opposite her. "Sorry, I really didn't do this. The two of you can do it yourselves. Goodbye." With that, she turned around and left. Yunshi was dumbfounded. She glanced at Ning Shuema and then at Shinjioli and said in surprise, "Jioli." Shinjioli was speechless. While Ning Shuema was walking forward, she suddenly felt a strong force pulling her collar. She didn't have time to react as her body was continuously pushed back until she was standing in front of the chessboard. Only then did the force on her collar disappear. Ning Xuema coughed nonstop as soon as she landed on the ground. She coughed for a while before she stopped. She looked up angrily and saw Shinjuli looking at her coldly. Shinjuli's face was as calm as still water, and his voice carried a trace of coldness. Apologize. Apologize. Was he going to apologize to Yunqi? Never. Ning Xuema glared at him angrily. She pursed her lips tightly and refused to say a word. Shinjuli waited for a while, but she did not apologize. He moved his hand, and Ning Xuema retreated a few steps in the air. Then, her body suddenly stiffened, and she was fixed in place. Shinjuli's voice carried a trace of coldness. I will let you go when you apologize. After he said this, he ignored her and started to play chess with Yunqi again. Ning Xuema looked up and saw his indifferent face and Yunqi's slightly raised lips. Very good. Ning Xuema stood there silently. She did not say a word, as if her mute acupoint had been sealed. The way she was fixed in place was a little strange. It happened to be the way she walked. One of her hands was raised and the other was lowered. One of her legs was slightly raised and the other was slightly bent. After standing for a while, Ning Xuema felt her arms and legs aching. Gradually, cold sweat started to form on her forehead. Her telekinesis had not recovered, so she was just an ordinary person now. The time it takes for an incense stick to burn passed, her body swayed slightly as she lifted her head to look at Shinjuli. He was still focused on playing chess. Out of nowhere, a jade teapot had appeared. At the moment, he was pouring tea for himself and filling a cup for Yunqi. Chapter 1206. The sky blue cup was translucent, and a dark green flower was slowly blooming in the dark green tea. Upon closer inspection, the flower wasn't a real flower. It was made up of countless petals and leaves that formed a beautiful flower. Steam rose in spirals from the tea, and the fragrance of the tea was cool and fragrant. Yunqi looked at Shinjuli with sparkling eyes and took a sip of the tea. She smiled and said, Julie, is this viburnum spring? Then, she looked at Ning Xuema with a mysterious smile and said, it is indeed a good tea. Shinjuli said indifferently, as long as you like it. Viburnum spring. Back then, she had been playing against Yunqi. The Almighty had poured a cup of fragrant viburnum spring for her. Through the steam of the tea, she had seen Yunqi's pale face. Now, the tables had turned. She had been fixed there. Shinjuli had poured tea for Yunqi, and Yunqi had smiled proudly as she held the tea. If she hadn't been nailed there, she would have applauded this scene. Ning Xuema's heart felt heavy, as if a huge rock was pressing down on it. She closed her eyes slightly and waited for the pain in her heart to pass. Shinjuli raised his head and looked at Ning Xuema. When he saw her pale face, he paused for a moment, but it was only for a moment. Before Yunqi could react, he lowered his head and calmly placed another piece. 2 hours passed, 4 hours had passed. She heard the crisp sound of pieces being placed, and in front of her was a beautiful scene of a pair of immortal lovers. She felt like a clown, frozen in a ridiculous position and unable to move. It was a strong contrast to the harmonious and beautiful scene between the two of them. Ning Xuema's whole body was in pain, but she still pursed her lips and didn't say a word. She would never apologize. Yunqi and Shinjuli had already played a few rounds, so time passed quickly. She looked up at Shinjuli and saw that he was still indifferent, but the speed at which he played chess was not as fast as before, and the time he spent in a trance was getting longer and longer. He seemed a little absent-minded. After finishing the game, Shinjuli said indifferently, all right, let's stop here. He glanced at Ning Xuema again. Seeing that she was still silent and had no intention of apologizing, he paused for a moment and turned to leave. Yunshi was stunned for a moment before she chased after him. At this time, it was already evening. Ning Xuemo thought that the sky outside must be filled with rosy clouds. The scenery of Tianyin Peak was still the same, just like that day when Shinjiuli patted her head and said to her, "Xuemo, wait for me to come back." He didn't expect that he would wait for 10 years. What's more, he didn't expect that after waiting for 10 years, he would end up in this situation. Ning Xuemo felt blood surging in her internal organs. She tried her best to suppress her emotions and analyze the situation rationally. She was in the wrong just now. She was too agitated. After all, the Almighty had lost his memory and was only treating her as an ordinary disciple. Wasn't it normal for a disciple to pour tea for a guest? Wasn't it normal to punish a disobedient disciple? Calm down, calm down. A child's voice faintly sounded in her heart. Don't you feel wronged? Don't you feel sad? He reprimanded and punished you for another woman. He used to love you so much. Ning Xuemo closed her eyes and tried her best to suppress the pain in her heart. She retorted in her mind, he has forgotten about me. He now treats me as his disciple. It's normal to reprimand a disciple. Chapter 1207. That child's voice chuckled, "Momo, are you trying to convince me or convince yourself? Is forgetting a reason? Do you think forgetting in the name of forgetting allows one to wantonly hurt you and be forgiven? Momo, do you really think so? Listen, your heart is crying, crying so loudly, can't you hear it?" Ning Xuemo took a deep breath, suppressing her churning emotions, and coldly said, "Get lost." That child's voice laughed like a little angel, "Momo, do you still remember how Shinjiuli treated you tenderly at Luoyin Cliff 10 years ago? He kissed you tenderly and told you to wait for him to come back, and now? You waited for 10 years, but what did you get?" Ning Xuemo's hands trembled slightly. Her heart seemed to be tightly gripped by a big hand, and even breathing was somewhat difficult. That voice was full of temptation and innocence. "Momo, this mortal world is too tiring, this emotion is too tiring, give up, let me help you, okay? Become a demon, it won't be so tiring if you become a demon." Ning Xuemo closed her eyes, feeling exhaustion crawling all over her body. Not only her body, but also her heart. She was really tired. Would becoming a demon really not be tiring anymore? This thought flashed through Ning Xuemo's mind. She was suddenly startled, and abruptly slapped this thought out of her mind. No way. She absolutely couldn't become a demon. A soft sigh sounded in her ears. That child's voice seemed to have a trace of pity. "Momo, why do you have to be like this? Who are you persevering for? Was it because of Shinjiuli? You're really stupid." Ning Xuemo tried hard not to listen to her words, but that voice sounded like a demon again. "Momo, let's make a bet, okay? Let's bet on when Shinjiuli will unseal your acupoints." Ning Xuemo coldly said, "I won't bet. Whether I win or lose, it won't do me any good." That voice chuckled, with a trace of temptation in her voice. "Momo, if I lose, I'll be silent from now on, and if you lose, you'll become a demon. Is that fair?" Ning Xuemo said sarcastically, "I refuse. I don't believe that you will fulfill the bet. Why should I bet with you?" There was a hint of joy in the child's voice, as if he was happy that he knew a secret. "Momo, this is not the real reason. You and I both know. The real reason is that you are not sure whether Shinjiuli will come or not, right? Momo, you're already disappointed in him, aren't you?" Ning Xuemo felt a sharp pain in her heart, as if someone was gripping her heart tightly. She said coldly, "Shut up." The child's voice laughed even more merrily, laughing unscrupulously. "Momo, I was right, wasn't I? I am you, and you are me. If you really didn't have these thoughts, how would I know? Momo, I know your heart better than you do, and I'm also more honest than you. Ning Xuema took a deep breath and forced herself to calm down. With a frosty face, she said word by word, I said, shut up. If you say one more word, I'll destroy my dantian and die with you. The child's voice laughed a few times and finally stopped talking. Ning Xuema opened her eyes and quietly looked at the sky outside, which was darkening little by little. The moon rose little by little, hanging high in the starry sky. The moonlight slowly flowed down on Ning Xuema's body like water. The night was getting darker, and the cold air was getting heavier. Her clothes seemed to be stained with water vapor, which made her skin feel cold. It was as if she was covered with a layer of frost. Her face was pale, her lips were slightly blue, and her eyes were dark, without any emotion. Chapter 1208. Ning Xuema's body was already numb. She couldn't feel anything. She kept looking at the door. There was no one outside, only the stars and the moon. She looked at the stars and the bright moon. Standing there, she seemed to be admiring the night scenery. Like a cold and hard stone statue, he stood there emotionlessly, his gaze fixed on the door. After some time, the night was like a thin veil that was peeling off layer by layer. The sky gradually turned white, and then it became bigger and bigger. The sky lit up bit by bit. Ning Xuema suddenly felt her acupuncture points warm up, and then she fell to the ground. She tried to stand up, but found that her legs were already numb, and she couldn't use any strength. She lay on the ground, pursed her lips, and rubbed her calves with her hands. At first, she didn't feel anything, but after rubbing for a long time, she felt a trace of warmth on her calves. Then, she felt pain and numbness, as if countless ants were biting her calves. She stood up with difficulty and staggered back to her room. There was no emotion in her eyes. All her emotions seemed to have been frozen in the lonely cold night last night. She covered herself with the blanket and quietly looked at the sky outside the window. She couldn't sleep at all. Her emotions were in a mess. Ning Xuema didn't know what she was thinking. That eccentric Lolita kept chattering in her mind again. She couldn't go on like this. Ning Xuema straightforwardly hit her own sleeping acupoint. Finally, it's quiet. Ning Xuema thought in a daze before she fell asleep. When she woke up, it was already evening. The setting sun only left a few strands of colorful clouds in the sky, and it was about to fall into the valley. She actually slept for a whole day without a single dream. Her whole body was sore. This was the after effect of standing for a whole night. Ning Xuema hugged the blanket and sat for a long time before she finally got up. She wanted to go out for a walk. She couldn't stay here all day. She looked down at her body. She was still wearing the old woman's clothes that Shui Lan had prepared for her. She sniffed her body and felt that it was going to rot. She looked around the room. It was cold and cheerless. She was the only one there. The furnishings in the room didn't change at all. Obviously, no one came to visit her after she slept in her room for the whole day. Shinjioli didn't come either. He probably forgot about her again, right? Even if she slept like a log in the room, he probably wouldn't notice. Ning Xuema shook her head abruptly, as if the bitterness in her heart was about to rise again. Stop. When did he become so sensitive? She didn't want to act like a resentful woman here, wallowing in self-pity. She quickly finished washing up and walked out of the door, walking aimlessly. When she came back to her senses, she was already at the entrance of the main hall. She looked at the door of the main hall and her lips curled up slightly. Logically speaking, as his disciple, she should go in and greet him. She might even have to kneel down. Logically speaking, when he had lost his memory, she should have tolerated it if she wanted to redeem him. However, there were too many negative emotions in her heart. What if Shinjioli was playing chess with Yunxi again? Wouldn't she be ordered around again? She felt uncomfortable all over. If she broke a pot or a cup, she was afraid that she would be fixed for the whole night again. The gains wouldn't make up for the losses. She should go down the mountain for a walk. Firstly, she needed to calm her emotions. Secondly, she needed to train her communication skills. She felt like she couldn't speak anymore. Chapter 1209. She was so bored that even she herself found it boring. Furthermore, she had to prepare some clothes and daily necessities for herself. The great god didn't care about her now, so she had to rely on herself to have enough food and clothing. Ning Xuemo thought for a moment, then turned and strode away. She arrived at the barrier. Not bad. Although the barrier set by Shinjioli wasn't the same as the previous one, it was still one that she had learned before, so she easily broke through it. She passed through the barrier and descended the Heavenly Note Peak. Following the small path, she walked around aimlessly. This place hadn't changed. It was still the same as before. Ning Xuemo was like a person who had been wandering for a long time returning to her hometown. She carefully observed the surrounding scenery. Dusk gradually enveloped them. Along the way, she naturally met a few disciples of the Sun-Moon sect. Those who recognized her naturally ran over to greet her. Those who didn't also followed the others to greet her. Everything seemed to be the same as 10 years ago. Ning Xuemo felt a little uncomfortable. She thought that the disciples who knew her would be surprised to see her return. She didn't expect this. Perhaps Shinjioli had already informed the Sun-Moon sect of her return. That's why they were so calm. A young disciple with delicate features suddenly ran over from afar. His face was like a little bun. He looked up and smiled at her softly. Then, he stuffed a blue voice transmission talisman into her hand. Then, he quickly ran away. Ning Xuemo looked at the voice transmission talisman in her hand. For a moment, she didn't react. The blue voice transmission talisman lit up slightly. A clear male voice came from it. Xuemo. It was Yelu Jinghen. Hearing the voice of an old friend, Ning Xuemo was momentarily dazed. She didn't know what to feel. After a moment of silence, she replied, "It's me." Her voice was slightly cold. After she said this, she felt a little vexed. Yelu Jinghen had always treated her well. She shouldn't have been so cold. She had really been locked up by Shuailan. She almost didn't know how to communicate anymore. Fortunately, Yelu Jinghen didn't seem to mind. "Xuemo, come to the leisurely cloud pavilion." The light from the sound-transmitting talisman disappeared. Ning Xuemo stored it in her sleeve, feeling a little disappointed. She had been missing for 10 years, and her return seemed to be a little dull. Forget it, she could even accept the Almighty's indifference, so why should she care about other people's attitudes? After all, she wasn't very friendly to others right now. Ning Xuemo was not someone who was particularly calculative. After a moment of hesitation, she let go and walked towards the leisurely cloud pavilion. Perhaps Yelu Jinghen had something to ask, and it just so happened that she also had something to ask him. After walking through a few corridors, the leisurely cloud pavilion came into view. Just as he was about to step in, he suddenly heard a bang. And a beam of light shot up into the sky. Ning Xuemo reflexively looked up at the sky and saw a beautiful firework exploding in the sky. It was gorgeous and beautiful. Following that, fireworks shot up into the sky from all directions and exploded one after another. In the blink of an eye, the entire sky had been covered. The dazzling fireworks painted the deep blue sky with golden and silver lines. Finally, an even bigger firework shot up into the sky. When it slowly bloomed in the sky, a line of words appeared in the sky: Shuamo, welcome home. Ning Shuamo. She suddenly turned around and saw Yellow Jing and gentle smile in the night wind. Shuamo, welcome home. Behind him, the other senior brothers also turned around and smiled at her. Shuamo, you're finally back. Chapter 12:10. Ning Shuamo looked at them one by one. 8th senior brother, 9th senior brother, 12th senior brother. She suddenly felt warm in her heart. She didn't know why, but her eyes were a little moist. That faint sense of loss had already disappeared. Someone suddenly rushed out from the pavilion and made a beautiful turn in the air. He landed in front of Ning Shuamo and smiled like a flower. Shuamo. Martial uncle, you're finally back. You don't know how sad I was when I heard the news of your death. It was Helian Xiao. He opened his arms and planned to give Ning Shuamo a big hug. Yellow Jing and glanced at Helian Xiao indifferently. Her eyes contained a warning intent. Helian Xiao's arms froze in midair. He laughed dryly and retracted his arms. He patted 12th Martial Uncle, who was closest to Ning Shuamo, and said, Martial Uncle, Shuamo is finally back. She's clearly alive and well, but you guys came back to report that she was dead. I was so sad for a long time. 12th Martial Uncle rubbed his arms and glared at Helian Xiao. He looked at Ning Shuamo and sighed. Shuamo, when you were kidnapped by the great demon back then, we were so anxious. All the spies of the Sun-Moon sect were sent out to search for your whereabouts. After searching for half a month, we found a corpse in a valley. The corpse was covered in blood and was wearing your clothes. It was exactly the same as your figure. The blood was also yours. We thought it was you. Shui Lan indeed made a fake corpse to fool the people of the Sun-Moon sect. Ning Shuamo had already guessed it. Now that she finally got confirmation, she nodded. Helian Xiao couldn't help but interrupt. Martial Uncle Shuamo, how did you get kidnapped by the great demon back then? How did you survive all these years? Where did he hide you? Ning Shuamo's eyes deepened as she looked at the people around her. Naturally, she couldn't mention that she was hurt by Wu Mo in such an occasion. All right, let's not talk here. Shuamo just came back. Let's welcome her first, Yellow Jing and said. Let's go, Shuamo, let's talk inside. A group of people clustered around Ning Shuamo as they walked towards a large hall not far away. Ning Shuamo felt a sudden warmth in her heart when she arrived at the main hall. It was as if a warm current had washed over her. 2 rows of people stood in the main hall, obviously to welcome her. She looked at them one by one. Among these people, she knew some of them and some of them she didn't. However, all of them had a sincere smile on their faces as they looked at her and said in unison, Shuamo, welcome back. An old master rushed in front of her. He was so happy that his face bloomed like a chrysanthemum. Master! You're finally back. Master! Ning Shuamo was so shocked that she took a step back. She looked at the old man in front of her and finally recognized him. He was the old master who tested her on recitation. The pavilion was already prepared with good food and wine. A large group of people sat down and it was very lively. Yellow Jing and took the lead and raised his wine cup. His smile was as gentle as water. Shuamo, let me toast you. Welcome back. Ning Shuamo also raised her wine cup and drank it in one gulp. People she knew and didn't know kept toasting her. She didn't refuse anyone and accepted all the toasts. Helian Xiao didn't stop talking since the banquet started. He kept talking beside Ning Shuamo for half a day. If Ning Shuamo asked one question, he could answer 8 questions. With him by her side, Ning Xuemo also gradually relaxed. She drank and played games with everyone. Dear friends, from tomorrow onwards, there will be an explosive update for a few days. The real explosive update will be more than 100,000 words. Let everyone enjoy it. Everyone, please vote for me. Chapter 12:11. Fireworks bloomed continuously in the sky, each beautiful. Looking out the window, one could see that the fireworks took a lot of effort to create. Helian Xiao even controlled the wind to form a row of words in the sky. Marshal Uncle Xuemo, welcome home. Yilu Jing and couldn't help but laugh. Xuemo, these fireworks were created by this fellow. Ever since he knew that you were back, he has been creating them without rest. Ning Xuemo looked at the row of words in the sky and suddenly felt her heart grow warmer and warmer. Her mood also improved a lot, and most of the gloominess from before was washed away. Home, yes, she had already treated the Sun-Moon sect as her home. Now that she was back, she was indeed going home. The atmosphere of the banquet was very lively, and the climax was endless. Everyone was singing and laughing. The large group of people gradually celebrated until midnight before gradually dispersing. Helian Xiao walked beside Ning Xuemo and suddenly patted Ning Xuemo's shoulder. Marshal Uncle Xuemo, let's go. We haven't seen each other for 10 years. Let's find a place to continue drinking. Let's not go home until we're drunk. He drank a lot during the banquet, but he wasn't drunk yet. Ning Xuemo was a little tipsy. She hugged Helian Xiao's shoulder like a brother. Then we'll definitely drink you until you're on the ground. Let's go, Helian, let's not go home until we're drunk. On the roof of a large hall, the stars were shining brightly, and the moon was bright. Ning Xuemo and Helian Xiao each hugged a wine jar and were drinking with each other. The two of them drank one jar, and they drank as if they were drinking water. In the blink of an eye, they drank 7 to 8 jars. Xuemo, it's great that you're back. You don't know that after you left, the entire Sun-Moon sect went crazy looking for you. In these 10 years, they didn't really stop looking for you. Especially Little Apple. After you got into trouble, it ran away and has been frantically looking for you outside. Oh right, did you meet Little Apple? Helian Xiao hugged a wine jar and asked. He was already 80 to 90% drunk, and he was stuttering when he spoke. Ning Xuemo drank a lot tonight. She, who wouldn't get drunk even after 1,000 cups, was already a little muddle-headed. She was already seeing double when she looked at Helian Xiao. She only heard half of what Helian Xiao said, and her brain was also in a half-shut state. She smiled drunkenly and asked, Little Apple? Who was Little Apple? Why did you come up with such a fun name? Helian Xiao touched her head and said exaggeratedly, you don't have a fever. Little Apple is your family's Kirin. Have you forgotten? Kirin. Hearing this, Ning Xuemo finally came to her senses. She slapped his hand away and asked, Little Apple went out to look for me. It hasn't come back yet. Helian Xiao nodded and said loudly, of course. Back then, after you were injured and went missing, Little Apple ran out to look for you like a madman. After that, it also went missing. In the past 10 years, there hasn't been a single trace of it. That's why everyone thought it was you when they found that corpse. If Little Apple had always been in the Sun-Moon sect, as long as it was in good condition, your lives would be connected, and everyone would be more at ease. Why, you haven't met it all this time. Then where could it have gone? Ning Xuemo's mind exploded. She hurriedly tried to sense Little Apple in her heart, but she couldn't sense it at all. Under Shui Lan's control, it wasn't strange that she couldn't sense Kirin. Now that it had come out, why couldn't she sense it? Could it be that Little Apple had also been killed by Shui Lan? This was Ning Xuema's first reaction. The wine jug in her bosom slipped and fell to the ground. With a gurgling sound, it fell to the ground and shattered into pieces. Chapter 12:12. Ning Xuema was stunned for a while before she realized that her 10-year contract with Little Apple had expired. She couldn't sense Little Apple anymore. Realizing this, Ning Xuema's mood fell again. However, she was slightly relieved. Maybe it was just that she couldn't contact Little Apple because the 10-year contract had expired, but it didn't mean that Little Apple had met with misfortune. Kirin was quite clever. Other than Shuilan, there probably wouldn't be anyone who would really kill this kind of divine beast. Little Apple should be fine. Maybe it was lost somewhere else, like how it was lost in the stone spirit's stomach. That must be it. No, she had to look for it. That child was so ignorant. Once it was lost somewhere, it wouldn't even have the ability to escape by itself. Maybe it was living an extremely torturous life now, and maybe it was waiting for her to save it. Kirin's figure seemed to appear in front of her eyes. She felt as if a ball of fire was ignited in her chest. She suddenly stood up. No, I have to look for it. Before she could finish her sentence, her body suddenly swayed and she sat down with a plop, almost rolling down from the roof. Fortunately, Helian Xiao was quick to react and caught her. Be careful. Ning Xuema was very dizzy. She shook her head and wanted to stand up again. Helian Xiao held her down with difficulty. If you want to look for it, there's no hurry. You drank too much. Sober up first. I'm not drunk. Ning Xuema was like an ordinary person who drank too much. When she was completely drunk, she refused to admit it. I can still drink a few more jars. She was completely drunk now, and her tongue was twice as big. In order to prove her words, she picked up another wine jar from the side and broke the mud seal. This time, she used more strength. Not only did she break the mud seal, but she also cut off half of the jar's mouth. The wine flowed down and splashed on Helian Xiao's face. Helian Xiao. He raised his hand and wiped his face. He also drank too much and had been trying to stay sober. At this moment, he couldn't help but burst into laughter. Xuema, you're still saying that you're not drunk. You can't even slap the mud seal properly. Ning Xuema raised her head and laughed heartily. I did it on purpose. It's easier to drink like this. In order to prove that drinking like this was really satisfying, she picked it up and brought it close to the edge of the jar to drink. She swayed so much that she almost couldn't find her mouth. Half of the remaining half of the jar went into her stomach, and the other half went down her collar, soaking a large part of the front of her clothes. After she finished drinking, she threw the half of the wine jug down coolly. She used too much force and almost threw herself down as well. Helian Xiao hurriedly grabbed onto her. In his drunken haze, he originally wanted to pull her arm, but when he stretched out his hand, it went astray and directly grabbed onto Ning Xuema's collar. Ning Xuema still had her instincts. She subconsciously pulled at her collar. Let go. Helian Xiao's reaction was also close to sluggish. Not only did he not let go of her pull, his body swayed and he directly laid on top of her. Both of them almost rolled down together. Helian Xiao was, after all, slightly lighter than Ning Xuema. He hurriedly stretched out his arms and legs to stabilize his body on the roof. Then, he realized that he was still lying on top of her. Below him was a soft and fragrant body. It was the beauty that he once secretly longed for. He was drunk and looked at Ning Xuema below him, forgetting to get up for a moment. Chapter 12:13. Ning Xuema almost spat out the wine she had drunk from being pressed down by him. Her face flushed red. Fortunately, she still had her instincts. She raised her hand and suddenly exerted force. Helian Xiao was caught off guard and flipped off her body. Helian Xiao rolled on the spot and finally stabilized his body. At this moment, he was lying on his stomach. He vaguely felt that the sky was covered by darkness. His drunken eyes saw a white-clothed person in front of him. He opened his eyes wide and tried to identify the person. When he saw the person clearly, he almost slipped and fell. Di Zun. It was actually Di Zun. In an instant, cold sweat covered his body. He was mostly sober. He jumped up and pulled the similarly drunk Ning Xuemo up at the same time. He whispered in her ear, "Wake up, Xuemo. Di Zun is here." Ning Xuemo's head was spinning at this moment. Seeing the person in front of her, she saw double again. She felt that someone was swaying in front of her. She frowned and muttered, "Stop swaying. You're making me dizzy." Her legs went soft and she almost fell down again. Helian Xiao hurriedly wanted to pull her up, but he felt a force stopping him. Just as he was about to throw caution to the wind, he felt an ice-cold gaze sweep past him. All the hair on his body stood on end. With this delay, Ning Xuemo fell hard on the roof. She frowned in pain and complained, "Helian, why didn't you pull me up?" Helian Xiao couldn't say anything. He stood there with a red face. He wanted to pull her up, but Di Zun wouldn't let him. Ning Xuemo wanted to get up by herself, but suddenly, a force lifted her up and made her stand firm. At the same time, a cold voice sounded in her ear, "Did you wake up from the fall? If you don't, you'll fall again." Ning Xuemo quickly straightened her body to show that she was awake. She tried to open her eyes and barely saw who was in front of her. She picked up the wine jar again and smiled foolishly at Shinjioli as if she was presenting a treasure. "Master, you're here. Do you want to drink a jar?" Shinjioli, Helian Xiao was speechless. Shinjioli waved his hand, and the wine jug in Ning Xuemo's hand suddenly fell to the ground, shattering into pieces and splashing wine everywhere. Helian Xiao felt that his heart had also been ruthlessly smashed onto the ground along with the wine jug, smashing into smithereens. He felt that his fate would probably be the same as that wine jar. He wanted to turn around and run away, but he was worried that Ning Xuemo would be punished. Therefore, although he was scared, in the end, he still stood there with a lot of backbone. "Grandmaster, it's my fault. I dragged Martial Uncle Xuemo here to drink. If you want to punish me..." Before he could finish his words, Shinjioli's cold stare killed his words in his stomach, and he couldn't continue. Ning Xuemo was a little sober. She shook her head and tried to focus her eyes in one direction. "Master." Shinjioli's tone couldn't hide his anger. "You still know to call me master. You didn't pay your respects or practice martial arts today, and instead ran down here to drink in violation of the sect's rules. You fooled around until midnight and didn't go back. Fooled around until midnight and didn't go back." Why did this sentence sound so funny? She felt that Shinjioli's tone at this moment was like a resentful wife complaining about her husband coming home late. Ning Xuemo giggled a few times, but she felt that something wasn't right and suppressed it again. However, she was now a slow-witted person and couldn't completely control her own emotions. Therefore, she couldn't suppress it and laughed again regardless of the occasion. She laughed until Shinjioli's expression became more and more unsightly. Helian Xiao wished he could cover her mouth. Chapter 12-14. How could this girl be so bold after drinking? She actually dared to laugh at the ancestor? At the same time, he was puzzled. The ancestor had never cared about them drinking before. Why did he suddenly get angry this time? But even if Helian Xiao had 10 times the courage, he wouldn't dare to ask the ancestor this question. Thus, he lowered his head and tried his best to reduce his presence. Moreover, he was worried about the obviously drunk Ning Xuemo. But he didn't expect the ancestors' anger to immediately spread to him. Helian Xiao only felt an ice-cold gaze fall on him. Helian Xiao felt that his hair was about to stand up and dance. His whole body was unbearably cold, as if he had fallen into an ice cave. Immediately after, he heard the ancestor's voice, which was as cold as the winter snow, say, offending your superiors and drinking together. Go to the cliff of reflection and reflect for a year. A year. Helian Zhao's entire face fell, but he could only say, yes. With a bitter face, he went to the cliff of reflection to reflect. At this time, Ning Xuemo had already stopped laughing, but she was too drunk. She only heard half of the conversation between Helian Xiao and Shinjiuli. She tilted her head and looked at Shinjiuli, puzzled, and asked, "What cliff of reflection?" "There's actually a cliff of reflection, in the Sun-Moon sect. How come I don't know about it?" Shinjiuli picked her up and flew with the wind. At the same time, he said coldly in Ning Xuemo's ear, "When you wake up, I'll throw you in there and understand you well." Ning Xuemo hugged his waist and said dizzily, "Then it's better not to understand." "Master, fly slower, I'm cold." She was actually still being picky. Shinjiuli resisted the urge to throw her down. His speed suddenly doubled, like a shooting star streaking across the night sky. Ning Xuemo hugged his waist tightly and muttered, "Master, are you sitting on a rocket? What's the rush?" She opened her hazy eyes and looked at Shinjiuli, asking curiously, "Master, why do you have two heads?" TSK, the great god is indeed the great god. You actually have one more head than ordinary people. Shinjiuli, it was one thing for this troublesome disciple of his to not greet him for a whole day, but she actually ran down to drink with a group of people without his permission. She was punished to stand for an entire night, so she was probably feeling very unhappy. It was not impossible for her to ask her senior martial brothers and junior martial nephews to help her out. If you want to drink, then drink. Therefore, when he noticed that she had run down the mountain to meet with those people, he did not take it to heart. He thought that she would come back when she was almost done drinking. After all, Yilu Jing and was a steady person. With him here, Ning Xuemo wouldn't do anything out of line. Therefore, Shinjiuli did not pay attention to this matter for the entire day. However, he was still worried about her. Even when he was cultivating, he would always pay attention to her return. However, he didn't expect that even after waiting until midnight, the lass still hadn't returned. Only then did he come out, and from afar, he saw the two drunk people rolling together on the roof. At that moment, he felt a burst of anger in his heart. He had the urge to kick Helian Xiao out of the Milky Way. Fortunately, he had always been extremely calm and rational. He quickly saw that these two people were so clumsy because they drank too much. Moreover, when he fell down, Helian Xiao had already been pushed away. He endured again and again, and only then did he stop himself from kicking Helian Xiao down, this disgraceful lass. Drinking with a man, and getting so drunk as if she was a puddle of mud. Wasn't she afraid of being taken advantage of? Not only did she not have the slightest trace of remorse, she even threw a drunken tantrum at him. Chapter 12-15. I must teach her a good lesson and make her remember it for the rest of her life. Shinjiuli flew back to Tianyin Peak and went straight to Yunshui Lake. He was now hanging over Yunshui Lake, his white robe fluttering in the night wind. Looking at Ning Xuemo, who was drunk to the point of unconsciousness and full of nonsense, his eyes flashed with a trace of hesitation. Ning Xuemo hugged Shinjiuli's arm and tried to open her eyes wide, saying, "Master, don't shake me, you're making me dizzy." Did you use Naruto's shadow clone jutsu? I think you actually saw 4. Very good, it was obvious that he was dead drunk. Shinjuli's eyes were cold, and his hand loosened. Ning Xuema only felt her body suddenly sink, and before she could react, she fell into the lake with a plop. The bone-chilling cold lake water instantly swept from all directions, drowning her mouth and nose. Being stimulated by the cold water, Ning Xuema finally sobered up quite a bit. She shivered as she was surrounded by pitch-black lake water. The scene of her being drowned alive by Yi Qinghuan seemed to be playing out once again. Fear swept over her like a tide. She desperately wanted to swim up, but her brain was paralyzed by alcohol, and her limbs didn't seem to belong to her. She was so anxious that she choked on a mouthful of water. The feeling of suffocation came, and her brain was in a daze. I'm going to drown again. This realization made her extremely frightened. She struggled desperately, but she couldn't break free from the lake water that was coming from all directions. She wanted to ask for help, but she choked on a mouthful of water as soon as she opened her mouth. She finally shouted while floating, "Help! Cough cough help, cough cough cough." Shinjuli floated in the air, looking at Ning Xuema who was struggling below with his arms crossed, and a flash of surprise flashed through his heart. Didn't she know how to swim? Why was she struggling like this? Hey, why was he so sure that she knew how to swim? He just saw her. When Ning Xuema shouted for help, he finally couldn't help but rush down and raise his hand to pick her up. Only then did he realize that her face was pale and her eyes were rolled up. She had already fainted. His heart sank, and some kind of emotion floated up and down in his chest. His heart felt like it was being squeezed by someone. Without thinking, he hurriedly used his internal energy to help her force out the water that she had choked on. Fortunately, she didn't drink too much water. Ning Xuema finally woke up after spitting out a few mouthfuls of water. She even spat out a lot of wine, so her mind was much clearer. When she woke up, she saw Shinjioli looking down at her. She was so angry that her whole body was trembling. She raised her hand and slapped him. Shinjioli tilted his head to avoid it. His face darkened. Just as he was about to throw her down again, he suddenly heard her angry voice, "Shinjioli, you bastard. You said you would never drown me again. You want me to believe you. But you threw me down with your own hands today." Shinjioli froze. He met her angry eyes. "Did I say that?" Ning Xuema was stunned. Then, she suddenly burst into laughter. "Yes, how could I forget? You've already forgotten me. You've already forgotten me. How could you still remember what you said in the past? Ha 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 ha, you forgot. You forgot everything." She laughed until her whole body was trembling. Tears glistened in her eyes. Shinjioli felt as if someone was ruthlessly squeezing his heart. It hurt terribly. He pursed his lips. How could he forget only her? He had forgotten everyone else. If Yunshi hadn't reminded him, he wouldn't even remember the sun-moon sect. Everything was slowly becoming familiar.